Across the earliest traces of civilization, scattered fragments of stone, script, and silence still hold the outlines of achievements that reshaped human history. From cities rising out of river valleys to structures aligned with unseen patterns in the sky, these are not merely relics of the past, but evidence of how ancient societies began to impose order on chaos, meaning on uncertainty, and permanence on time itself. In this unfolding journey, you move through the first cities of Sumer, the origins of writing, the rise of law under early kings, and the monumental engineering of ancient Egypt and ancient Rome. You will trace ideas carved into stone, encoded in stars, and buried beneath earth and sand, each revealing how civilizations built systems to understand their world. Across deserts, rivers, temples, and forgotten roads, patterns begin to emerge, suggesting that these achievements were never isolated but part of a larger human attempt to define existence itself. The first cities of Sumer. Along the slow-moving rivers of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris River and Euphrates River drifted across a flat and unpredictable landscape, the earliest outlines of organised human life began to take shape in ways that had never existed before. By around 3500 BCE, settlements such as Uruk, Ur, and Eridu had grown beyond clusters of homes into something far more complex. Dense urban centres where thousands lived within defined boundaries, surrounded not by wilderness alone but by walls, canals, and systems that suggested careful design rather than gradual chance. What emerged in this region, later known as Sumer, was not simply an increase in population but a transformation in how human beings structured existence itself. The land offered both opportunity and instability, as seasonal flooding could nourish crops or erase entire harvests depending on its timing and force, forcing inhabitants to confront nature not as a distant threat, but as something that demanded constant negotiation. In response, the people of Sumer constructed extensive irrigation networks, diverting river water through canals and levees that required coordination on a scale no small village could sustain, quietly binding individuals into shared systems of labour and dependence. These efforts did more than secure food. They introduced the necessity of organisation, leadership, and planning, laying the groundwork for administrative control that would define city life. It was within these engineered landscapes that agriculture became reliable enough to support specialists, craftsmen, traders, priests, allowing society to expand beyond mere survival. Within cities like Uruk, which at its height may have held tens of thousands of inhabitants, space itself began to reflect hierarchy and purpose, with towering temple complexes rising above tightly packed homes, signalling both religious devotion and centralized authority. The most prominent of these structures, the early forms of what would later be known as ziggurats, were not merely places of worship but focal points of economic and political power, where offerings, storage, and distribution converged under the oversight of priestly elites. These institutions functioned as both spiritual centers and administrative hubs, managing surplus goods, recording transactions, and reinforcing a structure in which authority was no longer personal or temporary, but embedded within the city itself. As populations grew, so too did the complexity of daily life, and with it came the need to track resources, labour, and agreements with greater precision than memory alone could provide. Around 3200 BCE, in the same urban environment of Uruk, early forms of writing, now recognised as cuneiform, began to appear on clay tablets, initially as simple pictographs used to account for goods, but gradually evolving into a system capable of recording language, law, and narrative. This development did not emerge in isolation. It was a direct response to the demands of city life, where transactions multiplied, relationships extended beyond immediate communities, and the permanence of record became essential to maintaining order. Through these markings, decisions could outlast individuals, and authority could be preserved beyond the limits of human memory. Trade extended the reach of these cities even further, as materials not found in the fertile but resource-limited plains of Sumer, such as timber, stone, and metals, were brought in from distant regions through networks that connected Mesopotamia to Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and beyond. Merchants moved along established routes, exchanging goods that carried not only economic value but also ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, subtly linking distant societies into a broader system of interaction. The city, once defined by its immediate surroundings, became part of something larger, its influence shaped as much by what lay beyond its walls as by what existed within them. Yet beneath the appearance of order, these early cities were not static achievements, but fragile systems that required constant maintenance, vulnerable to environmental change, conflict, and internal strain. Walls were built not only to define space, but to defend it, suggesting that competition between city-states was an ever-present reality, while shifting river courses could undermine the very infrastructure that sustained them. Each solution introduced new challenges, and each advancement carried with it the need for further adaptation, creating a cycle in which stability was never fully secure. In these places, for the first time, human life was organized on a scale where identity, labor, belief, and power were woven into a single interdependent structure, transforming scattered communities into something enduring yet precariously balanced. And in the shadow of those first rising cities, the question quietly took shape, whether humanity had created its greatest achievement or its most fragile experiment. The birth of writing, cuneiform, and the power of memory. Long before anything was written down, knowledge existed in a fragile state, carried only in the minds of those who could forget, misremember, or disappear without warning. In early communities, agreements, traditions, and transactions depended entirely on spoken words and shared memory, systems that worked only while societies remained small and tightly connected. But as settlements expanded into cities like Uruk, where populations reached into the tens of thousands by the late 4th millennium BCE, the limits of memory began to show themselves in subtle but consequential ways. Promises could be disputed, inventories could be miscounted, and authority could be challenged simply because there was no permanent trace of what had been said or decided. Out of this growing uncertainty, small impressions pressed into wet clay began to take on meaning, forming the earliest attempts to hold information still. Archaeological evidence from southern Mesopotamia shows that by around 3200 BCE, administrators in Uruk were using simple pictographs to represent goods such as grain, livestock, and labor, inscribing them onto clay tablets that could be dried and stored. These markings, which would evolve into what is now known as cuneiform, did not begin as language in the modern sense, but as a practical response to complexity, a way to track resources in a world where economic activity had grown too intricate to manage through memory alone. Each symbol reduced ambiguity, turning fleeting exchanges into fixed records that could be referenced long after the moment had passed. As these markings became more consistent, they quietly shifted authority away from individuals and into records that could be stored, verified, and enforced. Clay tablets held within temple and administrative centers documented deliveries, debts, and distributions, creating a system in which accountability no longer depended on personal trust but on physical evidence. Those who controlled these records, scribes trained to read and write the increasingly standardized signs, occupied a unique position within society, acting as intermediaries between spoken agreements and written proof. In this way, writing did more than preserve information, it reinforced structures of power, ensuring that decisions could be maintained beyond the presence of those who made them. Over time, what began as simple accounting expanded into something far more enduring, allowing words, decisions, and stories to survive beyond the limits of a single lifetime. By the 3rd millennium BCE, cuneiform had developed into a flexible system capable of recording not only transactions, but also laws, correspondence, and literature, including compositions like the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest known works of written narrative. These texts preserved reflections on mortality, kingship, and human experience, suggesting that writing had begun to capture not just material life, but the inner concerns of those who lived within it. What had once been temporary, spoken stories carried from one generation to the next, could now be fixed in clay, resistant to the distortions of time and memory. With the ability to record ideas externally, human thought itself began to change, no longer confined to memory, but extended across surfaces that could be revisited and refined. Complex instructions could be organized, calculations could be checked, and knowledge could accumulate in previously impossible ways, allowing each generation to build upon what had been recorded rather than starting anew. Writing created a continuity that stretched beyond individual lifespans, linking past decisions to present actions in a way that gave societies a deeper sense of permanence. It allowed not only the preservation of information, but the gradual expansion of understanding as ideas could be compared, corrected, and developed over time. Gradually, a dependence formed that few could have recognized at the time, as societies entrusted their knowledge to symbols that required interpretation rather than recollection. Oral traditions did not disappear, but they were increasingly complemented, and sometimes replaced, by written records that carried a different kind of authority, one that appeared more stable yet was shaped by those who inscribed it. Writing introduced a quiet shift in how truth was perceived, as what was recorded could be treated as definitive, even when it reflected the perspective or intention of a limited few. In preserving knowledge, it also filtered it, embedding decisions about what was worth remembering into the very structure of the record itself. And somewhere within those first deliberate marks, memory ceased to belong entirely to the human mind. The Code of Kings, law under Hammurabi. Disputes could erupt without warning, and when they did, there was often no single answer to what was fair or who had the right to decide. In early Mesopotamian societies, justice was shaped by memory, custom, and the influence of those in power, meaning that outcomes could vary depending on status, circumstance, or persuasion. As cities expanded and interactions became more complex, these inconsistencies created tension, especially in places where trade, labour, and property required clear expectations. Without a stable framework, conflict was not only frequent but unpredictable, leaving communities to rely on shifting judgments that could change from one case to the next. During the reign of Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE, an attempt was made to bring order to this uncertainty by setting rules that would no longer shift with circumstance. In the city of Babylon, a large stone stele was erected, inscribed with nearly 300 laws written in Akkadian using cuneiform. At its top, a carved relief depicts Hammurabi standing before the sun god Shamash, receiving authority, a visual assertion that these laws were not merely human decisions, but carried divine legitimacy. Placed in a public setting, the stele transformed law into something visible and enduring, accessible not through memory alone but through permanent inscription. Carved into stone and written in cuneiform, these laws transformed decisions into something fixed, visible, and difficult to challenge. They addressed a wide range of situations, from theft and property damage to contracts, wages, and family relations, creating a detailed framework that governed both economic and personal life. Once inscribed, these rules could be referenced and enforced consistently, reducing the ambiguity that had previously defined justice. The presence of written law shifted authority away from individuals making isolated judgments, and toward a system backed by both the king and the perception of divine order, reinforcing the idea that justice was no longer negotiable but defined. At the centre of this system was a principle that tied punishment directly to the offence, creating a structure that was precise but not equal. Often summarised by the phrase an eye for an eye, the code established proportional consequences, yet these consequences varied depending on social class, distinguishing between free citizens, dependents, and enslaved individuals. The same act could result in different penalties depending on who committed it and against whom, revealing a hierarchy embedded within the law itself. Justice, in this sense, was consistent in form but unequal in application, reflecting the social order it was designed to preserve rather than challenge. Beyond resolving conflicts, the code extended into daily life, shaping behaviour through rules that governed trade, labour, family, and obligation. It regulated wages for workers, set standards for construction, and outlined responsibilities within households, reaching into nearly every aspect of existence within the city. Builders could be punished if structures collapsed, merchants were bound by agreements recorded and enforced, and families were subject to laws that defined inheritance and conduct. In this way, the code did not simply respond to wrongdoing, it anticipated it, creating a system in which actions were guided by known consequences rather than uncertain outcomes. Long after the reign that produced it had ended, the code remained as evidence that authority could be preserved not only through force, but through written order. Though not the earliest set of laws in Mesopotamia, it is one of the most complete and well-preserved, offering a detailed glimpse into how a complex society sought to impose structure on human behaviour. Its influence echoes through later legal traditions, where the idea of codified law, fixed, recorded, and publicly known, became a foundation for governance. What began as a solution to uncertainty evolved into a lasting model for how power could define, enforce, and sustain order across generations. In fixing justice into stone, something once debated in the moment became something far more difficult to question. The Pyramids of Giza, engineering against eternity. Resting across the edge of the Giza Plateau, the pyramids present themselves not as stories to be told, but as physical statements that have remained unchanged for thousands of years. Their presence is immediate and uncompromising, rising from the desert as geometric forms that seem less like human constructions and more like interruptions in the landscape itself. Built from millions of limestone blocks, their scale resists casual comprehension, not because the details are unknown, but because the accumulation of those details produces something that feels disproportionate to its origin. Even from a distance, they do not suggest fragility or ruin, but permanence, as though time has moved around them rather than through them. Within the reign of Khufu during Egypt's Old Kingdom, an undertaking began that required not only authority, but an ability to coordinate resources on a scale that still challenges modern understanding. The construction of the Great Pyramid, the largest of the three major pyramids at Giza, demanded the organization of labor, materials, and time in a way that extended far beyond the lifespan of a single moment or ruler. What is known from archaeological evidence is that this was not an isolated effort, but part of a broader tradition of royal mortuary architecture, where the pyramid functioned as both tomb and symbol of divine kingship. Yet even with this context, the sheer magnitude of planning required remains difficult to fully reconstruct. Along the shifting banks of the Nile River, massive limestone blocks were transported and positioned with a level of precision that appears almost detached from the limitations of its time. The river itself provided a vital transportation route, allowing stone quarried from nearby regions to be moved closer to the construction site, likely during seasonal inundations when water levels expanded access across the landscape. Archaeological studies suggest that ramps, sledges, and coordinated human labour were used to position these blocks, although the exact methods remain partially debated. What is not in dispute is the accuracy of alignment, particularly the orientation of the pyramids to cardinal directions, which reflects a sophisticated understanding of geometry and observation without reliance on modern instruments. Among the three great structures rising at Giza, each associated with rulers of Egypt's Old Kingdom, the question of intention is anchored in what is known and unsettled in what remains incomplete. The pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure are generally understood as royal burial complexes, integrated into larger funerary landscapes that included temples, causeways, and subsidiary structures. Inscriptions and surrounding archaeological evidence support their connection to royal mortuary practices, yet many aspects of their internal design and broader symbolic purpose continue to invite interpretation. Their scale suggests not only preparation for death, but an attempt to define permanence itself in architectural form, transforming individual rule into something embedded within the landscape. During the annual cycles when the Nile's flooding temporarily reshaped the land, large groups of workers were organized into systems of labor that allowed construction to continue across generations. Evidence indicates that these workers were not slaves in the later popular imagination, but seasonal laborers who contributed during periods when agricultural activity was reduced, supported by food supplies and organized settlements near the construction sites. This system required planning that extended beyond simple manpower, involving logistics for housing, feeding, and coordinating thousands of individuals over decades. The pyramids, in this sense, were not only monuments of stone but also monuments of sustained human organization, built through repetition, rhythm, and continuity rather than sudden effort. Despite centuries of study, the alignment, scale, and execution of these monuments continue to reflect a level of coordination that resists simple explanation. Their precision remains measurable, yet the full integration of knowledge, labor, and time required to achieve it still raises questions about how such consistency was maintained across generations without the technological frameworks that define construction today. The structures endure not only as archaeological artifacts but as records of capability, preserving within their geometry a trace of methods that are partially understood but never fully visible in their entirety. Even now, the stones still hold the shape of a question that has never stopped being asked. The Secrets of Mummification and the Afterlife. When life ends without warning, what remains is not silence alone, but a body that still occupies space while something essential is no longer present. In ancient Egypt, this moment of separation was not treated as a simple conclusion, but as a disruption that required intervention, because death was understood not only as an ending, but as a transition whose outcome depended on what was done with what remained. The presence of the dead body created an immediate problem of continuity, as identity was believed to risk dissolution without careful preservation, and so the treatment of death became a structured response to an existential uncertainty, rather than a passive acceptance of loss. Through carefully developed embalming practices in ancient Egypt, the process of mummification emerged as a deliberate attempt to slow the inevitable transformation of the human body after death. Historical and archaeological evidence shows that this process involved the removal of internal organs, dehydration of the body using natron, and careful wrapping in linen, all performed with increasing refinement over centuries of practice. These procedures were not arbitrary but systematic, reflecting an accumulated understanding of decomposition and the environmental conditions that could delay it. What developed was not simply burial preparation, but a technical method designed to preserve recognizable form against the forces of decay that naturally followed death. Within ancient Egyptian belief systems, the continued existence of the self was understood to depend on the preservation of the physical form that once contained it. The body was not viewed as separate from identity, but as an essential anchor for it, connected to spiritual components such as the Ka and Ba, which required recognition of the physical world to maintain continuity beyond it. Without the body, these aspects of existence risked fragmentation, and so preservation became a necessity rather than a symbolic gesture. This understanding shaped not only funerary practice, but also the architectural and ritual systems surrounding burial, ensuring that identity was treated as something that extended beyond death only if properly maintained. Across funerary traditions preserved in texts such as the Book of the Dead, detailed instructions were recorded to guide the deceased through imagined stages beyond the physical world. These writings, compiled over time and adapted across different periods, contained spells, declarations, and ritual knowledge intended to assist in navigating a realm where moral and existential judgment determine the fate of the soul. One of the most enduring concepts associated with these beliefs is the weighing of the heart, a symbolic judgment in which moral conduct was measured against cosmic order, reflecting a worldview in which ethical behavior was inseparable from metaphysical consequence. In this system, knowledge of death was not speculative but organized, recorded, and transmitted as structured guidance for what lay beyond life. Inside burial chambers prepared for the dead, everyday objects were arranged with the expectation that the conditions of life would need to be reconstructed beyond death itself. Food, tools, ornaments, and symbolic items were placed alongside preserved bodies, reflecting the belief that existence after death would still require familiarity with the material world. Tombs were designed not as empty memorials, but as carefully composed environments intended to sustain identity in a non-living state, mirroring life in a controlled and permanent form. This practice reveals a civilization that did not separate life from death as absolute opposites, but instead treated them as continuous conditions requiring careful management. While the body was protected through layers of ritual precision and material care, uncertainty persisted over whether preservation extended beyond physical form into anything recognizably human. The methods used were effective in maintaining appearance and structure, yet they could not confirm the continuity of consciousness or experience, leaving an unresolved gap between preservation and presence. What survived was form, but what that form represented in the absence of life remained beyond verification, suspended between belief and material reality. This tension quietly underlies the entire practice, as if preservation itself were both a solution and a question that could not be fully answered. What was sealed for eternity may have been preserved in form but never fully confirmed in meaning. The Library of Alexandria, humanity's lost mind. Conceptually, the ambition to gather every known piece of human understanding into a single location began to take shape in the intellectual environment of Alexandria, where knowledge itself was treated as something that could be physically collected and organized. Unlike earlier centres of learning that developed organically around temples or administrative systems, this effort carried an unusual sense of intentional scale, as if the boundaries of the known world could be compressed into a single intellectual space. The idea that texts from distant lands could be brought together, copied, and studied side by side suggested a shift in how knowledge was perceived, not as something tied to place or culture, but as something that could be accumulated, compared, and preserved within a unified framework. And historically, the early formation of what became the Library of Alexandria was linked to the efforts of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, who initiated large-scale acquisition and copying of texts from across the known world. Manuscripts written on papyrus were collected through trade, diplomatic exchange, and systematic copying, creating an archive that reportedly extended across a wide range of subjects and languages. Scholars working in Alexandria engaged in translation and transcription, making works accessible across cultural boundaries and transforming the city into a convergence point for intellectual traditions that had previously developed in isolation. This process was not merely archival but active, as texts were studied, revised, and sometimes compared in ways that expanded their interpretive scope. Within its expanding collections, works spanning mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were gathered together, creating an environment where intellectual traditions from different civilizations began to overlap. Observational sciences such as astronomy were refined through comparative study of earlier records, while medical knowledge drew from accumulated texts that reflected centuries of practical experimentation and theory. Philosophical works from Greek traditions existed alongside Egyptian and Near Eastern knowledge systems, producing a layered intellectual landscape where ideas were not confined by geographic origin. In this sense, the library functioned not only as a storage space but as a site of intellectual interaction, where knowledge could be examined in relation to other forms of understanding. Stored on papyrus scrolls that were highly susceptible to fire, moisture, and decay, the accumulated records of centuries existed in a state of constant vulnerability, despite their intellectual significance. Unlike stone inscriptions or architectural monuments, these materials required continuous care and protection, and their survival depended on environmental stability and institutional continuity. The fragility of papyrus meant that even the most carefully preserved texts could be lost under unfavourable conditions, making the preservation of knowledge an ongoing challenge rather than a completed achievement. This physical vulnerability introduced a tension between the scale of intellectual ambition and the impermanence of the medium used to sustain it. Over time, historical accounts suggest that the gradual decline of the library occurred through a series of losses and disruptions, rather than a single clearly documented moment of destruction. Ancient sources and later historical interpretations vary in describing the extent and timing of its disappearance, leaving modern understanding fragmented and incomplete. What is generally agreed upon is that the library's contents were not preserved in their entirety, and that successive periods of political change, conflict, and neglect contributed to the erosion of its collections. The result was not an abrupt absence, but a slow reduction of accumulated knowledge dispersed across time and circumstance. Beyond the physical disappearance of texts, the fragmentation of the library also meant the interruption of continuous scholarly transmission across multiple fields of ancient knowledge. Ideas that might have been refined through uninterrupted study were instead scattered, preserved only in partial forms, or later rediscovered independently in different contexts. This loss affected not only specific works, but also the broader intellectual continuity that might have connected ancient scholarship more directly to later periods. In this way, the absence of the library represents not just missing books, but missing pathways of development within the history of ideas. In its absence, it left behind entire pathways of understanding that seemed to end before they ever reached the present. Stonehenge and the language of the sky. Across the earliest observations of the natural world, the repeated movement of the sun, moon, and stars established a rhythm that unfolded long before any human attempt to record it. In prehistoric Britain, this rhythm would have been impossible to ignore, as shifting light and seasonal change shaped survival, guiding planting, harvesting, and movement across the land. Long before written systems existed, the sky functioned as a consistent framework of repetition, offering patterns that could be observed but never controlled. In this environment, time itself was not measured in numbers or records, but in the return of celestial events that arrived with quiet certainty. On the landscape of prehistoric Stonehenge, massive stones were positioned over many generations in ways that align with specific points of solar movement. Archaeological evidence shows that the monument developed in stages over a long period, beginning with earthworks and later incorporating large standing stones transported from considerable distances. The effort required to move and position these stones suggests sustained coordination across communities, even though the exact social structures behind the construction remain uncertain. What is clear is that the site was not created in a single moment, but gradually shaped through repeated decisions that refined its orientation toward the sky. Through carefully arranged openings and sightlines within the stone formation, the rising and setting sun during solstices becomes visually framed in a way that suggests deliberate astronomical awareness. At certain times of the year, particularly during the summer and winter solstices, sunlight aligns with specific points within the structure, creating moments where the movement of the sun appears to interact directly with human-made forms. These alignments have been documented through modern observation and analysis, confirming that the monument corresponds with solar cycles in ways that are difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. The structure, therefore, functions not only as a physical arrangement of stones, but also as a frame through which celestial motion can be observed. As seasonal cycles shaped agricultural life in prehistoric Britain, patterns in sunlight and darkness likely provided a consistent reference for marking the passage of time. The repetition of solstices and equinoxes offered natural markers that could be used to organise communal activity, particularly in societies dependent on environmental timing for survival. While the precise role of Stonehenge within these practices remains open to interpretation, its alignment with solar events suggests a relationship between the monument and the regulation of time. In this sense, the structure may have served as a fixed point within a world governed by shifting seasonal conditions, anchoring human awareness to predictable celestial cycles. Despite extensive archaeological study, no written record exists to explain the original intention behind the construction, leaving interpretation dependent entirely on material evidence. Without textual explanations, understanding must rely on the arrangement of stones, patterns of alignment, and traces of activity found in and around the site. This absence of direct testimony creates a gap between observation and meaning, where the physical structure remains visible, but its conceptual purpose remains partially inaccessible. As a result, Stonehenge exists simultaneously as a well-documented archaeological site and as a question that cannot be fully resolved through evidence alone. Modern astronomical measurements confirm that the original alignments still correspond closely with solar positions during solstices, despite the passage of thousands of years. This persistence reflects the stability of celestial mechanics, where the movement of the Earth and Sun continues in cycles that remain consistent over vast spans of time. The stones themselves have shifted slightly due to natural and human factors, yet the overall orientation retains its relationship to solar events. This continuity creates a rare connection between prehistoric construction and present-day observation, where ancient alignments can still be traced through modern scientific understanding. Some alignments appear complete yet still refuse to explain what they were meant to reveal. The Indus Valley, a civilization without a voice. Scattered through the floodplains shaped by the Indus River system, the remains of the Indus Valley civilization reveal an unexpected level of urban organization that appears fully formed in the archaeological record, without any confirmed readable narrative explaining its origins or development. Emerging around 2600 BCE during the Bronze Age, this civilization stretched across parts of present-day Pakistan and northwest India, covering a region comparable in scale to Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, yet leaving behind no deciphered texts that describe its rulers, beliefs, or internal history. What is known comes not from preserved words, but from the quiet consistency of its physical design, as if the society itself prioritized function and order over self-documentation. Excavations at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa uncover carefully aligned street grids, sophisticated drainage systems, and standardized brick construction, suggesting a level of city planning that operated with remarkable precision across vast distances. Streets were laid out in straight lines intersecting at right angles, while houses were built with baked bricks of uniform proportions, often featuring private wells and bathing areas. Beneath the surface, covered drainage channels carried wastewater away from homes, indicating an advanced understanding of sanitation rarely matched in other early urban centres. These features suggest not only technical knowledge, but also a shared vision of how a city should function, maintained across generations without any surviving written directives. Standardized ratios observed in weights, seals, and construction materials indicate that multiple Indus settlements followed shared systems of measurement, pointing to coordinated practices that extended far beyond a single city. Carefully shaped stone weights, often made from chert, appear in consistent increments across different sites, implying regulated trade and economic exchange. Brick dimensions also follow a recurring ratio, typically 1, 2, 4, reinforcing the idea of a standardized approach to construction. Such uniformity suggests an underlying system of governance or cultural agreement, yet no palaces, royal tombs, or monumental inscriptions have been found to clearly identify centralized authority, leaving the mechanisms of control and organization open to interpretation. Inscribed seals recovered from Indus sites contain short sequences of symbols arranged in repeating patterns, yet despite extensive archaeological and linguistic study, the Indus script remains undeciphered and cannot yet be read in any confirmed language. These inscriptions, often carved onto small steatite seals, usually consist of only a few characters, accompanied by animal motifs such as bulls or mythical composite creatures. Unlike longer texts found in other ancient civilizations, these brief markings provide limited context, making it difficult to determine whether they represent names, titles, transactions, or religious symbols. Without a bilingual reference like the Rosetta Stone, efforts to decode the script have remained inconclusive, leaving an entire system of communication just beyond understanding. Artifacts found in Mesopotamian archaeological layers confirm that goods originating from the Indus region reached distant trade networks, showing that this civilization was deeply connected to the wider ancient world, even though its internal written communication remains inaccessible. Indus seals have been discovered in cities such as Ur, and Mesopotamian records refer to a distant land known as Meluha, which many scholars associate with the Indus region. Materials such as carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, and other crafted goods moved across these networks, suggesting established trade routes by land and sea. These exchanges demonstrate that the Indus Valley was not isolated, but actively engaged with neighbouring civilizations that left far more readable accounts of their own activities. Reconstruction of the Indus Valley society depends entirely on archaeological interpretation, as every known detail about its cities, systems, and daily life must be inferred from physical remains rather than from any confirmed textual explanation. The absence of clear evidence for kingship, large-scale warfare, or monumental propaganda has led some researchers to suggest a more decentralized or differently structured society, though such conclusions remain debated. Even its decline, which began around 1900 BCE, is understood through environmental shifts, changing river patterns, and gradual urban dispersal rather than through recorded events. Each discovery adds detail, yet also reinforces how much remains uncertain when interpretation must replace direct testimony. Every seal and carved symbol points toward a civilization that still has no recorded voice we can read. The Great Wall of China, a barrier across time. A boundary stretches across northern China, marking not just territory but the deliberate separation between worlds, perceived as ordered and those seen as threatening. Known today as the Great Wall of China, this vast network of fortifications does not exist as a single continuous structure, but as an accumulation of walls, passes, and watchtowers built over centuries. Its presence suggests a persistent concern with defining limits, where control ended and uncertainty began, turning geography itself into a line of defense shaped by human intention. Long before it formed a continuous system, separate states constructed defensive walls to guard their own borders during periods of sustained conflict. During the era known as the Warring States period, regional powers such as Qin, Zhao, and Yan built fortifications to protect agricultural land from raids and incursions, using locally available materials like packed earth and timber. These early walls were practical responses to immediate threats, rising quickly and often unevenly across landscapes that offered little natural protection, forming a fragmented barrier that reflected political division rather than unity. With the rise of Qin Shi Huang in 221 BCE, previously isolated fortifications were connected and expanded into a larger defensive network under centralized authority. After unifying the warring states, the Qin administration ordered the linking of existing walls and the construction of new sections to defend against northern nomadic groups. Labor forces composed of soldiers, conscripted peasants and prisoners were mobilized on a massive scale, working under strict conditions to extend the boundary across difficult terrain. Though much of the Qin-era wall was made of tamped earth and has not survived in its original form, its construction marked the first attempt to impose a single defensive vision across a vast empire. Construction methods shifted depending on the landscape, with builders using tamped earth in arid regions and stone or brick in mountainous terrain. Rather than cutting straight across the land, the wall follows natural contours, winding along ridges, crossing deserts, and tracing the edges of valleys where visibility and strategic advantage could be maintained. This adaptability reflects an understanding that defense could not ignore geography, requiring the structure to respond to the environment as much as it attempted to control it. The result is not a uniform wall, but a series of interconnected segments shaped by the conditions in which they were built. During the Ming dynasty, earlier structures were reinforced and extended into the more durable forms that remain visible today. Faced with renewed threats from northern groups, the Ming rulers invested heavily in rebuilding the wall using bricks and stone, adding watchtowers, signal systems, and fortified passes that allowed for coordinated defense. Smoke signals by day and fire by night could transmit warnings across long distances, transforming the wall into not just a barrier but a communication network designed to respond quickly to movement beyond its borders. Labour for the wall drew from soldiers, peasants and prisoners, many of whom worked under harsh conditions that often proved fatal. Construction sites were frequently located in remote or inhospitable regions where extreme weather, limited supplies, and the physical demands of building large structures took a heavy toll. While exact numbers are unknown, historical accounts and later traditions acknowledge the significant human cost associated with its construction, embedding the wall not only in the landscape but also in the memory of sacrifice tied to its existence. Despite its scale, the wall did not form an impenetrable barrier, as invading forces at times found ways to bypass or breach its defences. Groups such as the Mongols were able to cross into Chinese territory, demonstrating that no physical structure could eliminate the possibility of intrusion. The wall functioned as a deterrent and an early warning system rather than an absolute defence, reflecting the limitations of even the most extensive fortifications when confronted with adaptable and determined adversaries. Rather than a single construction effort, the wall represents centuries of rebuilding, adaptation, and continued attempts to secure shifting frontiers. Each dynasty that contributed to its expansion did so in response to its own challenges, layering new sections over old foundations and redefining the boundary according to changing political and military realities. In this way, the wall becomes less a finished monument and more an ongoing process, shaped by repeated decisions to defend, reinforce, and redefine the limits of control. Its stones record not a single moment of defense, but a recurring decision that was never fully resolved. The Terracotta Army, Guardians Beneath the Earth. Farmers digging a well in Shanxi province uncovered fragments of clay figures that would lead to the discovery of the Terracotta Army, buried for more than 2 millennia. What began as scattered pieces soon revealed itself as part of a vast subterranean complex, where rows of human-sized figures lay hidden beneath layers of soil, arranged in patterns that suggested not random placement, but deliberate design. As excavation expanded, the scale of the discovery grew, exposing corridors filled with soldiers standing in silence, their presence preserved in a state that appeared neither ruined nor abandoned, but intentionally concealed. At the centre of this underground world lies the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, whose rule extended beyond life through the creation of an elaborate funerary complex. Having unified China in 221 BCE, he ordered the construction of a burial site designed to mirror the structure of his empire, complete with defensive forces and administrative elements intended to function after death. Historical accounts written by the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian describe a tomb containing rivers of mercury and mechanisms designed to protect its interior, though much of this central chamber remains unopened. the army discovered nearby appears not as decoration but as part of a larger system meant to preserve imperial authority in a different realm. Thousands of life-size soldiers stand arranged in precise military formations, accompanied by horses and chariots positioned as if awaiting command. Infantry units line the front, with archers, cavalry and officers placed according to rank and function, reflecting the organisation of a real Qin military force. Estimates suggest that more than 8,000 figures were created, each placed within long trenches that extend across the excavation site. Their arrangement is not symbolic or abstract, but structured in a way that mirrors battlefield deployment, suggesting that the army was intended to operate as a functional extension of the emperor's power rather than as a static tribute. Close examination reveals that no two faces are exactly alike, with each figure displaying distinct features shaped through a combination of standardized parts and detailed finishing. Heads, torsos, arms, and legs were produced separately using molds, then assembled and refined by artisans who added individual characteristics, hairstyles, and expressions. This balance between repetition and variation allowed for the creation of a vast number of figures without sacrificing a sense of individuality, resulting in an army that appears both unified and uniquely human. Differences in posture, armour and rank further reinforce the impression that these figures were modelled after real soldiers, or at least intended to represent them with convincing detail. Clay was moulded, assembled and fired in sections before being joined into full figures, many of which were originally painted in vivid colours that have since faded due to exposure after excavation. Pigments applied to the surface once gave the army a lifelike appearance, with painted armour, facial features and garments enhancing the realism of each figure. Bronze weapons, including swords, spears and crossbows, were placed alongside the soldiers, many of which remain sharp and well preserved, indicating advanced metallurgical techniques. The level of craftsmanship involved suggests coordinated production on a massive scale, supported by skilled labour and careful planning. This underground army was intended to serve as a protective force in the afterlife, reflecting beliefs that authority and structure would continue beyond death. Rather than relying solely on spiritual or symbolic protection, the emperor's tomb was equipped with a physical representation of military strength, as if the same systems that governed the living world would remain necessary beyond it. The presence of such an army suggests that power, once established, was not meant to end, but to persist in a controlled and organised form, extending the reach of imperial rule into an unseen domain. Large portions of the tomb complex remain unexcavated, with historical accounts describing inner chambers that have yet to be fully explored. Concerns about preservation, particularly the potential damage to fragile materials and the reported presence of mercury, have limited further excavation, leaving significant parts of the site concealed beneath the ground. What has already been uncovered offers only a partial view of the full complex, suggesting that additional structures and artifacts may still lie hidden, waiting to be revealed under conditions that can ensure their survival. Beneath the earth, an army still stands in formation without ever receiving its final command. The Royal Road of Persia, connecting an empire. Across vast stretches of arid plateau, mountain passes and desert corridors, a system of movement began to take shape in the ancient Near East that relied not on a single traveller's endurance, but on a carefully maintained chain of human continuity, where each messenger carried only part of a journey that never truly paused. Within the territories of the Achaemenid Empire, communication became a structured necessity rather than an unpredictable effort, as the distance between the imperial centre and its farthest provinces demanded something more reliable than caravans or isolated riders. What emerged was a network that transformed time itself into something that could be compressed, managed and extended through coordination. The challenge of governing such an expansive domain became increasingly evident as administrative decisions needed to reach distant regions with consistency and authority, particularly across territories that included diverse cultures, climates, and local systems of rule. The empire's scale meant that even minor delays in communication could alter outcomes in taxation, military coordination, or provincial governance, creating a need for a system that functioned continuously rather than intermittently. In this environment, distance was not simply a geographic condition, but a political problem that demanded structural innovation. Under the rule of Darius I, this necessity was addressed through the formal organisation and expansion of existing routes into a unified imperial communication network, later remembered for its extraordinary efficiency. The road linking key administrative centres such as Sardis and Susa became one of the most significant arteries of this system, not because it was a single engineered highway in the modern sense, but because it was supported by a coordinated administrative structure that ensured its constant usability. Through royal oversight, the route was maintained, monitored, and standardized in ways that allowed it to function as a continuous channel of imperial communication. Along this network, relay stations were positioned at carefully measured intervals, allowing riders to exchange horses and continue their journey without the delays that would normally exhaust a single courier. Ancient accounts, most notably those associated with Herodotus, describe a system in which messages could traverse immense distances in remarkably short periods, not because a single rider moved with supernatural speed, but because the system itself never stopped moving. Each segment of the journey was absorbed by a new rider, creating a chain of motion that turned endurance into coordination. The infrastructure supporting this network extended beyond simple roadways, incorporating guarded waypoints, supply stations, and maintained passages that adapted to the diverse terrains they crossed, from river valleys to highland routes. These elements ensured that messengers were not merely travelling but were being sustained by an administrative framework that recognised communication as a critical instrument of governance. Over time, this allowed the route to function not only as a means of issuing commands, but also as a conduit for information flowing upward from the provinces back to the imperial core. As merchants and officials moved along the same corridors, the system gradually became more than an administrative tool, evolving into a channel through which goods, ideas, and cultural influences circulated between regions that might otherwise have remained loosely connected. The speed and reliability of communication enabled the centre of the empire to respond to distant developments with a degree of immediacy uncommon for the ancient world, reinforcing authority not through constant physical presence, but through consistent reach. Yet even within this remarkable system, the full extent of its influence across perception, control, and connectivity remains only partially understood. Some empires are remembered for the land they held, but others endure through the pathways that allowed their presence to arrive before they ever did. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, myth or masterpiece? At the height of its power, the city of Babylon stood as a centre of monumental construction, where walls, temples, and gates projected the authority of its rulers across the surrounding plains. Its scale was not only political but architectural, shaping how later generations would imagine the possibilities of urban achievement in the ancient world. Within this landscape of engineered grandeur, later tradition would place one of its most enduring and uncertain marvels. Among the wonders later attributed to this city, one description stands apart for its ambition: a series of elevated gardens said to rise in layered terraces above the ground. These accounts describe vegetation flourishing in an environment where such growth would have seemed unlikely, supported by systems that allegedly brought water upward through continuous effort. The image itself is striking not only for its beauty, but for the engineering challenge it implies within a region defined by heat and dry terrain. Centuries after Babylon's prominence, writers such as Strabo and Diodorus Siculus recorded accounts of a structure that appeared to merge architecture with cultivated landscape. Their descriptions vary in detail, yet consistently present an image of elevated greenery sustained by advanced irrigation methods. These narratives, however, were written long after the period of Babylon's greatest construction activity, introducing a layer of distance between observation and event. What emerges from these accounts is not a single consistent design, but a collection of descriptions shaped by distance, interpretation, and time. Each version reinforces the idea of a monumental garden, yet none converge on a precise architectural plan or universally agreed upon location. This inconsistency becomes central to the mystery itself, as the structure exists more clearly in description than in unified historical record. In contrast to these detailed portrayals, surviving records from Babylon itself offer no clear confirmation of such a construction. Extensive documentation of the building projects, temple restorations, and royal works attributed to the Neo-Babylonian period does not directly reference a structure matching the described gardens. This absence does not eliminate the possibility of their existence, but it introduces a silence that stands in tension with the vividness of later accounts. The prominence of the gardens in later traditions stands in quiet contrast to the silence found within the administrative and architectural records of the city. Babylon's material legacy, preserved through ruins and inscriptions, reveals a civilization deeply engaged in monumental construction. Yet the specific feature that would later become one of its most famous symbols remains unverified within its own archaeological footprint. This divergence between memory and material evidence becomes one of the central challenges in interpreting the tradition. Modern analysis has introduced alternative possibilities, including the suggestion that the descriptions may reflect gardens located elsewhere in Mesopotamia rather than within Babylon itself. Some interpretations propose that advanced irrigation landscapes in the broader region could have inspired or been merged into later accounts, gradually forming a unified image in classical storytelling. These theories do not resolve the question, but instead expand the range of possible origins for the narrative. Ultimately, the image that survives is one assembled from fragments of description, where certainty dissolves into the distance between observation and memory. The gardens remain present in language, yet elusive in material form, existing in a space where history and interpretation overlap without fully resolving into either. Their place within the ancient world becomes less a fixed structure and more an enduring question about how wonders are preserved when evidence is incomplete. Some of the ancient world's greatest wonders may have been built not in stone, but in the persistence of belief. The Phoenicians, masters of the sea and alphabet. Movement defined them before any map ever could, as a people whose presence was measured not by borders, but by the distances they crossed. The culture later identified as Phoenician emerged not as a unified empire, but as a network of city-states along the eastern Mediterranean, where independence did not prevent connection, and identity was shaped through interaction rather than isolation. Without vast inland territories to command, their influence would come to depend on something less visible yet far more adaptable. From this constant motion, ships became more than vessels, turning into extensions of knowledge carried across open water. Timber from the forests of the Levant provided the material for seafaring construction, while experience passed through generations, refining their ability to navigate coastlines and currents. These voyages were not isolated expeditions, but repeated movements that gradually expanded outward, linking unfamiliar shores through familiarity built over time. With each return journey, familiar paths grew into established routes that quietly connected distant regions. Goods such as glass, crafted materials, and the highly valued purple dye derived from murex shells moved across the Mediterranean, not simply as commodities but as markers of exchange between cultures. Through this circulation, information travelled alongside trade, carried in conversations, agreements, and shared practices that extended beyond any single port. At the edges of these routes, settlements such as Carthage took shape as enduring points within an expanding network. These were not merely distant outposts, but active centres that maintained connections with their origins while adapting to local conditions. Over time, such settlements reinforced the continuity of movement, ensuring that the network could persist even as distances increased and direct oversight remained limited. Beyond the exchange of goods, another form of transmission began to circulate, one that could move without weight or cargo. In a world where existing writing systems often relied on complex symbols or extensive training, a different approach began to take form, one that simplified the relationship between sound and sign. This shift did not emerge as an isolated invention, but as a practical adaptation within a culture defined by exchange and communication. By reducing language to a small set of symbols representing sounds, this system altered how information could be recorded and shared. The structure of this writing method allowed it to be learned more quickly and adapted more easily than earlier systems, making it especially suited to environments where interaction between different groups was frequent. Its value lay not only in what it recorded, but in how efficiently it could move between people. Carried alongside trade, these symbols travelled between ports, shifting subtly as they were adopted by different cultures. As merchants and sailors moved across the Mediterranean, the writing system moved with them, entering new regions where it was modified and reinterpreted. In this way, the same networks that transported goods also enabled the spread of ideas, linking communication to the same pathways as commerce. Gradually, versions of this system appeared beyond its place of origin, shaping the development of writing in neighbouring societies, including the early Greek world. The adaptation of these symbols into new forms would eventually influence writing traditions far removed from their original context, extending their impact across time as well as distance. What began as a practical solution within a network of exchange became a foundation for systems that would define how language itself could be preserved. Even as the physical traces of their maritime dominance faded, the effects of their exchanges continued in less visible but more enduring forms. Ports declined, routes shifted, and the identities of the original cities transformed, yet the patterns they established did not disappear with them. Their legacy remained embedded not in monuments or boundaries, but in systems that continued to function long after their origins were no longer clearly visible. What they carried across the sea did not sink with their ships, it continued wherever language found a new voice. Ancient astronomy, mapping the heavens before science. Above every landscape, long before it was studied, the night sky stretched outward as an expanse of scattered light without immediate meaning. It appeared constant yet unpredictable, a presence that changed subtly from night to night without offering an obvious explanation to those who observed it. Without instruments or formal systems, early observers encountered the heavens as something vast and distant, its movements too slow to notice in a single glance, yet impossible to ignore over time. Only through repeated observation did certain lights begin to return to familiar positions, revealing that what seemed random followed a hidden consistency. The same stars reappeared in the same arrangements across cycles, while others disappeared and returned with a regularity that suggested an underlying order. This gradual recognition transformed the act of looking upward into something more deliberate, as memory began to track what the eye alone could not immediately detect. As attention turned to the movement of the sun, patterns of light and shadow began to define the passage of days and the shifting length of seasons. The changing position of sunrise and sunset along the horizon offered a way to anticipate warmer and colder periods, linking celestial observation to survival itself. Over time, these patterns became essential for agricultural planning, allowing societies to align their activities with cycles that extended far beyond human control. More immediate and visible, the changing shape of the moon offered a cycle that could be tracked without instruments, marking time in recurring phases. Its predictable progression from darkness to fullness and back again provided one of the earliest frameworks for dividing time into smaller, manageable segments. Unlike the sun's slower seasonal shifts, the moon's cycle unfolded within a shorter span, making it easier to observe and integrate into daily life. To make the sky more understandable, fixed stars were grouped into recognizable patterns, forming constellations that transformed observation into memory. These groupings did not alter the stars themselves, but they created a framework through which the sky could be recalled, described, and shared across generations. By assigning shapes and narratives to these patterns, observers established a way to navigate the heavens using familiarity rather than randomness. Against this apparent order, certain points of light moved differently, drifting across the sky in ways that resisted simple classification. These wandering stars, later understood as planets, did not remain fixed within the constellations, instead shifting position over time in ways that complicated earlier attempts to impose structure. Their motion introduced a layer of uncertainty, suggesting that not everything in the sky followed the same predictable rules. Gradually, observations were no longer left to memory alone, as records began to capture the positions and movements of celestial bodies over time. In regions such as Mesopotamia, systematic recordings of planetary motion and eclipses reflected a growing effort to document patterns with precision. These records allowed observers to compare past events with present observations, turning isolated moments into part of a larger traceable sequence. These patterns did not remain purely observational, as their perceived regularity became tied to interpretations of events on Earth. Celestial movements were often understood as meaningful, influencing decisions, rituals, and the timing of important actions. While these interpretations extended beyond observation into belief, they were grounded in careful attention to recurring patterns that had been tracked over long periods. What began as watching evolved into a structured attempt to map the heavens, turning cycles into systems that could be studied and anticipated. Though these early frameworks did not yet resemble modern scientific models, they represented a significant shift from passive observation to active understanding. By identifying patterns, recording them, and attempting to interpret their significance, ancient observers laid the groundwork for later developments in astronomy. In learning to read the sky, they may have uncovered patterns that revealed as much about themselves as they did about the universe. Greek philosophy, the birth of rational thought. For generations, the world had been explained through stories that placed every natural event within the will of unseen forces. Storms were attributed to divine anger, seasons to the moods of gods, and human fate to narratives that left little room for doubt or investigation. Within this framework, explanation and meaning were inseparable, forming a worldview in which questioning the story itself was rarely considered necessary. At a certain point, some began to ask whether these explanations described reality, or simply gave it meaning. This shift did not immediately replace older beliefs, but it introduced a subtle tension between inherited narratives and direct observation of the world. In this emerging space of uncertainty, explanation itself became something that could be examined rather than merely accepted. In searching for answers, thinkers such as Thales proposed that the world might be governed by a single underlying principle rather than many competing forces. Instead of attributing natural phenomena to divine intervention, he and others sought explanations rooted in the nature of the physical world itself, suggesting that observable reality could be understood through consistent principles. This marked one of the earliest known attempts to separate explanation from mythology. As more voices entered the discussion, agreement gave way to contradiction, with each idea challenging the certainty of the last. Competing explanations for the structure of reality began to emerge, not as variations of a single tradition, but as fundamentally different interpretations of existence. This divergence did not weaken inquiry, instead it expanded it, turning disagreement into a catalyst for deeper exploration. Rather than offering conclusions, Socrates turned attention toward the process of questioning itself. Through dialogue and persistent inquiry, he exposed the instability of assumed knowledge, revealing how easily certainty could collapse under examination. His method did not aim to replace one explanation with another, but to refine thinking through continuous interrogation of ideas. Through the work of Plato, abstract thinking expanded into structured frameworks that sought to define reality beyond immediate perception. Concepts such as ideal forms suggested that what is seen is only a partial reflection of a deeper, more stable reality. This introduced a layered understanding of existence, where truth could exist beyond what is directly observable. With Aristotle, inquiry shifted toward observation and classification, grounding ideas in the study of the natural world. Rather than separating thought from experience, he emphasized the importance of systematic study, collecting and organizing knowledge from the physical environment. This approach laid early foundations for disciplines that would later evolve into formal sciences. Over time, this method of reasoning extended beyond nature into questions of ethics, governance, and logic. Philosophy became not just a way to explain the world, but a framework for evaluating human behavior, political systems, and the structure of argument itself. Its influence expanded across domains, shaping how later societies approached both abstract thought and practical decision-making. What emerged from these developments was not a single doctrine, but a way of thinking that could continue to evolve. Rather than closing questions, it established a process through which questions could be refined, challenged, and expanded indefinitely. This transformation marked a shift from accepting inherited explanations to actively constructing understanding through reasoned inquiry. Once questions began to demand reasons instead of stories, the search for answers no longer had a clear end. The Parthenon, perfection in stone. Rising above the Athenian Acropolis, the Parthenon took form in the mid-5th century BC as both a temple and a statement, built during the leadership of Pericles at a time when Athens sought to define itself not only through power, but through precision, order, and meaning carved into stone. Constructed between 447 and 432 BC, and dedicated to Athena, the structure emerged from the collaborative vision of architects Ictinus and Callicrates, under the artistic direction of the sculptor Phidias, whose influence shaped not only its decoration, but its symbolic weight. At a glance, it appears perfectly straight, perfectly balanced, and almost inevitable in its design. Yet this sense of perfection conceals a series of deliberate distortions, subtle adjustments that suggest the builders were not merely constructing a building, but correcting the limits of human perception itself. Measured in precise proportions and aligned with mathematical relationships that governed classical architecture, the Parthenon embodies the ideals of harmony associated with ancient Greek thought, particularly within the broader framework of Greek mathematics and philosophical inquiry. The columns, for instance, are not truly vertical. They lean slightly inward, while the stylobate, the platform on which they stand, curves gently upward toward the centre, counteracting optical illusions that would otherwise make the structure appear to sag. Each column swells subtly at its midpoint in a technique known as entasis, preventing the visual effect of thinning under the weight of the roof. These refinements, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, required a level of planning and execution that suggests not only technical mastery, but an understanding that perfection, in its truest form, could not be achieved through rigid geometry alone. Within its outer colonnade, the Parthenon once housed a massive chryselephantine statue of Athena, crafted by Phidias using gold and ivory, reflecting both the wealth of Athens and its devotion to its patron deity. Surrounding the structure, sculpted friezes and metopes depicted mythological battles and processions, including the Panathenaic festival, weaving together civic identity and divine narrative in a continuous visual language. These carvings, though damaged over centuries, still reveal a society deeply invested in the relationship between human achievement and divine favour, where art served not only as decoration, but as a record of belief, power, and aspiration. The building itself functioned as a treasury as well as a temple, holding the wealth of the Delian League, a reminder that its beauty was inseparable from the political and economic systems that sustained it. Yet even as it stood as a symbol of unity and dominance, the Parthenon carried within it the tensions of its time, constructed in part from resources drawn from allied city-states, raising questions among contemporaries about the nature of Athenian leadership and control. Over the centuries it would be transformed, from temple to church, from church to mosque, and eventually into a ruin shaped by conflict, including a devastating explosion in 1687 during a siege of Athens. What remains today is not the untouched perfection its builders envisioned, but a fragment that continues to suggest something larger, a design so carefully calculated that even in its broken state its balance endures. And in the quiet geometry of its surviving columns, there lingers the unsettling sense that its builders understood perfection as something that could only be approached, never fully seen. The Olympic Games, ritual, competition, and identity. Dust-covered roads leading into Olympia filled gradually with movement as scattered travellers from across the Greek world converged toward a single destination where time itself seemed to slow before the Games could begin. What appeared at first to be a temporary gathering was in fact part of a long-established cycle, traditionally traced back to 776 BC, where athletic competition became tied to religious observance and civic identity in a way that few other ancient traditions managed to sustain. The site itself, located in the western Peloponnese, was not a city in the conventional sense, but a sanctuary space, shaped by repetition rather than urban design, where each return of the Games layered new meaning over an already sacred landscape. Altars of burnt offerings and lingering smoke defined the centre of Olympia more than any athletic arena, where devotion to Zeus turned physical competition into a ritual act bound tightly to divine expectation. Before any race or contest could begin, sacrifices were made and oaths were sworn, binding athletes not only to rules of fairness, but to the belief that victory required divine acknowledgement. In this setting, the Games were not separate from religion, but inseparable from it, existing as an extension of worship where human strength and discipline were placed under the symbolic authority of the gods. Muscle, breath, and endurance replaced ceremony once the events commenced, each contest unfolding as a public measure of strength, where victory carried the weight of an entire city-state's reputation. Foot races tested speed over measured distances, wrestling demanded control over both body and balance, and pankration pushed physical struggle into forms that blurred the boundary between sport and survival. Victors were crowned not with wealth or permanent power, but with an olive wreath, yet their recognition extended far beyond the arena, as their names became tied to the identity of their home city, transforming individual achievement into a collective memory that could shape how entire communities were perceived across the Greek world. Declared peace during the Olympic truce existed only on parchment and proclamation, while tensions between rival Greek city-states remained suspended rather than resolved, waiting just beyond the sacred grounds. Conflicts between regions such as Athens, Sparta and others did not disappear during the Games, but the enforcement of the truce allowed travel to Olympia to continue without interference, creating a rare interval where competition replaced warfare as the primary form of confrontation. Yet this pause was fragile, dependent on shared religious respect rather than political unity, revealing that the harmony observed at Olympia was structured more by obligation than by genuine reconciliation. Repeated every 4 years across centuries, the gathering at Olympia gradually outlived the political conditions that created it, shifting from active tradition into a cultural memory shaped by what it once represented. As control of the Greek world shifted under Roman influence, the Games continued in altered form, gradually losing their original political and religious intensity, while still preserving their symbolic identity as a link to an earlier age. Even as their role changed, the concept of organised international competition endured, carried forward in memory, and later revived in modern reinterpretations that still echo the structure of the ancient event. When the last echoes of competition finally dissolved into the empty fields of Olympia, it became unclear whether what endured was a celebration of unity or a carefully preserved illusion of it. Roman roads, engineering and empire. Pathways carved across continents beneath Roman control gradually redefined the meaning of distance itself, as regions once separated by terrain and uncertainty were drawn into a growing framework of engineered connectivity that treated land not as a barrier but as something to be reorganised. What emerged under the expanding influence of the Roman state was not a single road but an entire philosophy of movement, where access, speed, and durability became instruments of governance as much as tools of travel, binding together provinces that would otherwise have drifted into isolation. Excavation layers beneath Roman roadbeds revealed a methodical approach to durability and drainage, where repeated structural patterns turned uneven landscapes into standardized routes built for endurance. Stones were not simply placed, but arranged in carefully considered layers, often beginning with a compacted foundation, followed by aggregates and fitted paving stones that allowed for both stability and controlled water runoff, ensuring that the roads could withstand both seasonal weather and constant military use. This consistency across vast distances reflected a system in which engineering knowledge was not isolated but replicated, carried by builders who followed principles that remained recognizable from one region of the empire to another. Legionary movements accelerated through the road network with a precision that allowed Roman forces to respond across vast territories in times that earlier civilizations would have considered impossible. Roads enabled armies to shift between frontiers with speed and coordination, reinforcing the Roman capacity to maintain control over regions that were geographically distant but strategically connected. In this sense, the roads functioned not only as infrastructure but as extensions of military presence, where the ability to move quickly often determined the stability of entire provinces under imperial rule. Administrative orders, tax records, and imperial directives travelled along the same routes as soldiers and merchants, transforming the road system into a silent carrier of governance across the empire. Messengers and officials moved continuously between administrative centres, ensuring that decisions made in Rome could be communicated and enforced in distant territories without the delays that would have fractured earlier systems of rule. This flow of information created a sense of cohesion across regions that differed in language, culture, and local governance, yet remained connected through shared dependence on the same physical network. Goods, languages, and customs began circulating through the same corridors of movement, where repeated contact between distant regions slowly reshaped cultural identity without a single defining moment of change. Olive oil from one province, grain from another, and manufactured goods from urban centres moved along these routes in steady exchange, while ideas, religious practices, and linguistic influences followed in parallel. Over time, the roads became more than channels of control, functioning instead as environments where cultures overlapped and adapted through sustained interaction rather than sudden transformation. Measured against the expanse of Roman territory, the road system appeared less like a finite structure and more like an ever-extending lattice that continued to branch beyond visible limits of control. From urban centres to remote frontiers, the network extended with remarkable consistency, suggesting a vision of the empire that depended not on isolated strongholds, but on continuous connection between them. Even at its greatest extent, the system implied further reach, as though the logic of the roads naturally resisted closure and instead demanded expansion. Maintenance requirements, shifting political stability, and regional decline exposed how deeply the Roman world depended on uninterrupted connectivity, where even minor disruptions could weaken larger imperial cohesion. Roads required constant repair to remain functional, and as the central authority weakened in later periods, sections of the network deteriorated, fragmenting the very system that had once defined imperial strength. What had been designed as a structure of permanence revealed itself to be dependent on the very stability it helped sustain, making infrastructure and empire inseparable in both strength and vulnerability. Faint lines of engineered precision still cut through the landscape where modern paths bend and break, leaving behind the impression that distance itself was once treated as something entirely conquerable. The Colosseum, power, spectacle, and control. Within Rome's dense urban core, gathering crowds often formed long before any official spectacle began, as anticipation itself became a familiar condition of public life shaped by expectation and control. The presence of mass audiences waiting for events to unfold was not incidental, but part of how Roman civic life organised itself, where public entertainment functioned as both social rhythm and political instrument. In this environment, attention became something that could be directed, delayed, and intensified, creating a shared psychological space in which spectacle existed even before anything physically began. Beneath the imposing exterior of the Colosseum, intersecting corridors, tiered passages, and structured entry systems revealed a design intended less for admiration than for the precise management of thousands of simultaneous movements. Built in the late 1st century AD under the Flavian dynasty, the amphitheatre was constructed on a scale that allowed entire populations to be sorted, guided, and seated with remarkable speed, relying on numbered entrances and carefully separated routes that reflected an advanced understanding of crowd control. The structure itself functioned as an engineered environment where visibility, access, and restriction were all calculated components of its design. Organised combat within the arena followed strict procedural rules that transformed physical confrontation into a regulated form of public display, where outcomes were predetermined by systems of authority rather than chance alone. Gladiatorial events, animal hunts, and staged executions operated within a framework that separated violence from chaos, turning it into a controlled sequence of outcomes presented for observation. While often remembered for its brutality, the system also depended on scheduling, oversight, and logistical planning that ensured each event served a defined public function rather than existing as uncontrolled conflict. Seating arrangements within the amphitheatre separated spectators according to status and privilege, turning the interior into a visible map of Roman society, where position directly reflected rank and influence. The emperor and elite classes occupied the most advantageous positions, while ordinary citizens and marginalised groups were placed in higher or more distant sections, making social hierarchy physically unavoidable within the space itself. This spatial organisation ensured that the experience of watching was also an experience of social awareness, where every glance reinforced an individual's place within the broader structure of Roman order. Collective reactions inside the arena often moved in waves that revealed how tightly emotion could be synchronized across massive audiences, creating shared responses that intensified the experience of spectacle itself. Applause, silence, anticipation, and shock did not exist as isolated reactions, but as coordinated responses shaped by the rhythm of events unfolding below. In this setting, emotion became something distributed across thousands of individuals at once, producing a unified psychological atmosphere that reinforced the power of the spectacle beyond its physical events. Public appearances by Roman authority figures during events turned moments of spectacle into stages of political communication, where decisions and gestures carried meaning shaped by visibility rather than speech. The emperor's presence was not passive observation, but active participation in the structure of meaning, where signals of approval or refusal could determine outcomes within the arena. In this way, governance became performative, embedded within entertainment, allowing authority to be seen as immediate, responsive, and inseparable from public display. Structural changes over centuries gradually altered the function of the amphitheatre, shifting it away from its original purpose while leaving behind a form that continued to dominate the surrounding urban memory. Earthquakes, material reuse, and changing political and religious conditions transformed the Colosseum into a fragmented structure, yet its scale ensured it remained a defining presence within Rome's evolving landscape. Even as its function dissolved, its architectural logic remained legible, preserving the outline of a system designed for control through visibility. The logic of spectacle continues to appear wherever large crowds are guided to look, react, and remain still without ever noticing the structure shaping their attention. Roman law, the framework of civilization. Legal authority in Roman society functioned as an abstract presence that only became visible when disputes, judgments, or civic conflicts required its activation. Unlike monuments or infrastructure that could be seen and physically measured, Roman law existed primarily as a structured expectation of behaviour, shaping decisions before they were ever formally questioned. It was not confined to a single place or moment, yet it defined how individuals, families, and institutions understood responsibility within an organised civic order. Written legal structure in early Roman governance emerged as an attempt to stabilise public life through documented rules that could be referenced beyond personal authority or oral tradition. One of the most important early developments was the tradition of codification associated with the 12 Tables, established in the mid-5th century BC, which represented a shift toward publicly accessible legal standards. This move reduced dependence on interpretation by elite groups alone, allowing citizens to reference written principles when disputes arose and gradually forming a shared foundation for civic expectations. Property rights, contractual obligations, and civic responsibilities were organised through legal principles that quietly shaped daily interactions without requiring constant enforcement. Transactions involving land, inheritance, trade, and personal agreements were increasingly structured around recognised procedures, giving stability to exchanges that might otherwise depend on informal trust. In this way, Roman law functioned as an invisible framework beneath ordinary life, ensuring that repeated interactions followed patterns that could be anticipated and enforced when necessary. Judicial interpretation within the Roman system allowed meaning to shift depending on context, where trained officials determined how established principles applied to specific circumstances. Magistrates and jurists played a crucial role in interpreting statutes, adapting general rules to complex cases that could not be resolved through the simple application of written text alone. This interpretive flexibility made the system both stable and adaptable, capable of responding to new social and political realities without abandoning its foundational structure. Administrative consistency was extended into newly incorporated regions of the Roman world, establishing shared procedural expectations that could function across culturally diverse populations. As Roman influence expanded, local systems of governance were often integrated into broader imperial frameworks, aligning them with common standards of citizenship, dispute resolution, and contractual recognition. This allowed vast and varied territories to operate under a recognizable set of principles, even when local customs and languages remained distinct. After the decline of centralized Roman governance, legal principles continued to be referenced, adapted, and preserved within emerging administrative systems that succeeded imperial control. In various forms, Roman legal reasoning persisted through later codifications and reinterpretations, influencing governance structures in regions that no longer identified politically with Rome itself. Its endurance was not tied to military power or territorial control, but to the practicality of its organization and its ability to structure authority in stable, transferable ways. Contemporary legal structures still reflect organizational patterns that originated in Roman legal reasoning, particularly in the way rights, obligations, and procedural fairness are defined. Many modern systems continue to rely on principles of codified law, judicial interpretation, and structured argumentation that can be traced back to Roman foundations, even as they have evolved into vastly different institutional forms. The underlying logic remains recognizable in the separation between written statutes and their application, where meaning is continuously shaped through interpretation. Order continues to rely on frameworks that are rarely seen directly, yet consistently shape how decisions are made, disputes are resolved, and authority is understood. Aqueducts and water systems mastering nature. Urban survival within major Roman settlements depended entirely on a continuous and reliable supply of water that could not be left to seasonal variation or local sources alone. As cities expanded in population and density, natural wells and nearby rivers were no longer sufficient to sustain daily life, forcing Roman engineers to develop systems capable of transporting water across vast and varied terrain. This dependence created a hidden layer of infrastructure beneath urban civilization, where survival was determined not only by architecture or governance, but by the uninterrupted movement of water into the heart of the city. Hydraulic design in Roman aqueduct systems relied on carefully calculated gradients that allowed water to travel long distances through controlled gravitational force without mechanical propulsion. Channels were constructed with precise slopes, often descending only slightly over many kilometers, ensuring that flow remained steady without becoming destructive or stagnant. Materials such as stone, brick and concrete lined these channels, reducing leakage and maintaining structural stability as water moved through elevated sections, tunnels, and surface conduits shaped by terrain rather than resisting it. Distribution networks connected aqueduct channels to reservoirs, bridges, and underground conduits that collectively formed an interconnected system feeding multiple points within urban environments. These networks did not end at a single destination but branched into multiple layers of delivery, supplying public fountains, private residences, baths, and administrative centres. Iconic structures such as elevated aqueduct bridges demonstrate how engineering adapted to geography, allowing water to cross valleys and uneven landscapes while maintaining consistent flow toward densely populated areas. Public baths, fountains, and sanitation systems operated through constant water availability, subtly shaping patterns of hygiene, social interaction, and civic infrastructure usage. Bathing was not only a practical necessity, but a structured social activity, supported by a steady water supply that enabled large-scale facilities to function daily. Fountains distributed water across public spaces, while drainage systems carried waste away, creating an urban environment where water movement defined both cleanliness and public life. Sediment buildup, structural wear, and channel obstruction required ongoing maintenance efforts that were essential to preserving consistent flow throughout the aqueduct network. Maintenance teams were responsible for clearing deposits, repairing cracks, and ensuring that gradients remained unobstructed, as even minor disruptions could affect supply downstream. This constant need for upkeep revealed that the system's strength depended not only on its original construction, but on continuous attention to its functionality over time. Engineering water distribution on such a scale represented a form of environmental organization in which natural resources were directed, regulated, and stabilized to meet urban demand. Rivers and springs were not merely used, but integrated into a controlled system that prioritized reliability over natural variability. In doing so, Roman engineers reshaped the relationship between settlement and environment, creating conditions where urban life could persist independently of immediate local water availability. Modern municipal water infrastructure retains fundamental design principles established in Roman aqueduct engineering, particularly in gravity-assisted transport and centralized distribution logic. While technologies have evolved, the underlying concept of moving water efficiently from source to population remains structurally similar, reflecting a continuity of engineering logic that extends far beyond its original context. The persistence of these principles highlights how deeply ancient solutions can remain embedded in modern systems of survival. The stability of entire cities once depended on something as unseen as a steady current moving through stone channels, quietly deciding where civilization could continue to exist. Mayan cities, architecture in the jungle. Uncontrolled water posed a persistent challenge to large settlements, as its movement could shift from essential resource to destructive force without warning. Rivers could flood beyond their banks, springs could diminish without notice, and stored supplies could become stagnant or contaminated if not carefully managed. For growing Roman cities, this unpredictability created a constant pressure to transform water from a natural uncertainty into something that could be directed with consistency. The need was not simply access, but control, ensuring that water arrived where it was required, in the quantity and condition that urban life demanded. Exact measurement governed every stage of aqueduct construction, where even slight deviations in gradient could interrupt flow or place strain on the entire system. Roman engineers designed channels with remarkably subtle slopes, often dropping only a few meters across many kilometers, allowing gravity to guide movement without accelerating it beyond control. Surveying tools such as the chorobates were used to establish level lines, while construction materials, including stone, brick, and waterproof concrete, maintained the integrity of these carefully calculated paths. Precision was not an added advantage but a necessity, as misalignment at any point could reduce efficiency or halt the system altogether. Arches, tunnels, and elevated channels were constructed to preserve alignment across uneven landscapes, allowing water to pass through obstacles without compromising its calibrated path. Valleys were crossed using multi-tiered bridges, while hills were cut through with tunnels that maintained consistent gradients beneath the surface. In certain sections, inverted siphons were used to carry water across depressions under pressure, demonstrating an understanding of hydraulic behavior that extended beyond simple flow. Each structural solution was designed not to dominate the terrain, but to adapt to it while preserving the delicate balance required for continuous movement. Controlled division points directed incoming water into separate channels, ensuring that supply could be allocated across public, private, and administrative uses. Large distribution tanks, known as castellum divisorium, separated the flow into regulated outputs, feeding fountains, baths, and in some cases private households. Access was not entirely equal, and allocation often reflected social and political priorities, with public amenities receiving consistent supply as part of broader civic planning. Through these regulated systems, water became not only a resource but a managed component of urban organisation. Structural weakness, mineral deposits, and external damage introduced constant risks that could disrupt the balance required for steady operation. Calcium carbonate buildup gradually narrowed channels, reducing flow over time, while seismic activity or ground shifts could fracture carefully constructed segments. Deliberate interference, whether through unauthorized tapping or damage during conflict, added further instability. These vulnerabilities revealed that the system's success depended not on permanence but on its ability to resist and recover from ongoing threats. Continuous supervision was necessary to monitor flow conditions, repair damage, and maintain the precise functioning of interconnected components. Officials known as curatores aquarum were responsible for overseeing maintenance, coordinating repairs, and ensuring that water distribution remained consistent across the network. Workers regularly inspected channels, cleared obstructions, and reinforced weakened sections, recognizing that neglect in one area could have consequences far beyond its immediate location. The system demanded attention not as an occasional effort, but as a continuous obligation. Modern water systems continue to reflect principles of calibrated movement and controlled distribution first established in Roman aqueduct design. While contemporary infrastructure relies on advanced materials and mechanical assistance, the underlying reliance on gradient, pressure management, and regulated allocation remains structurally familiar. The endurance of these principles demonstrates that the Roman approach was not merely effective for its time, but foundational in shaping how water is managed within large populations even now. Everything held together only as long as each measured line remained exact, leaving the fate of entire cities resting on a balance that could never afford to slip. The Mayan calendar, time as a living force. Time was understood not as an empty sequence, but as a patterned presence, unfolding through repeating intervals that carried meaning beyond simple measurement. Within ancient Maya society, the passage of days was not treated as a neutral progression, but as something shaped by cycles that could be recognized, anticipated, and interpreted. This perspective transformed time into an active element of existence, where each moment belonged to a larger structure that extended beyond immediate experience. Celestial movements provided consistent reference points, allowing careful observation of the sun, moon, and planets to establish recurring cycles across the sky. The motion of the sun defined the solar year, while lunar phases introduced shorter rhythms that could be tracked with precision. Particular attention was also given to the planet Venus, whose appearances and disappearances were recorded over long periods. reflecting a detailed understanding of its cycle. These observations were not isolated but accumulated over generations, forming a reliable basis for organizing time through repeated astronomical patterns. Two distinct calendar systems operated simultaneously, interweaving shorter and longer cycles into combinations that repeated only after extended intervals. The Tzolk'in, a 260-day cycle, functioned alongside the Harb, a 365-day solar calendar, creating a system in which each day was defined by the interaction of both counts. This combination produced a larger cycle known as the calendar round, which repeated approximately every 52 Harb years. Through this layered structure, time was experienced not as a single line, but as overlapping sequences that aligned at specific intervals. Extended calculations tracked the passage of time across vast spans, recording sequences that reached far beyond individual lifetimes. The long count system provided a method for marking dates in a continuous count of days, allowing events to be placed within a much larger temporal framework. Monument inscriptions throughout Maya sites preserve these calculations, anchoring historical moments within cycles that extended thousands of years into the past and future. This approach reflects an awareness of time that moved beyond immediate cycles into something more expansive and enduring. Specific dates were associated with particular qualities, linking moments in time to events, actions, and ceremonial significance. Days within the Tzolk'in were believed to carry distinct characteristics, influencing decisions related to rituals, leadership, and daily activities. Rather than choosing moments at random, actions were often aligned with dates considered appropriate or favourable within the cycle. In this way, time was not only tracked but interpreted, shaping behaviour through its perceived qualities. Recurring patterns allowed expectations to form, as previously observed cycles suggested that certain conditions would return in recognisable ways. The repetition of celestial events and calendar alignments created a sense that time moved through phases that could be anticipated, even if not fully controlled. This did not imply certainty, but it provided a framework through which change could be understood as part of a larger sequence. Recognition of recurrence offered continuity, connecting present experience with past observation. Modern study continues to examine these calendrical structures, revealing layers of astronomical knowledge and cultural meaning embedded within their design. Decipherment of inscriptions and analysis of surviving codices have shown the sophistication of Maya timekeeping, highlighting its integration of observation, mathematics, and belief. Far from being a simple method of counting days, the calendar represents a complex system for interpreting the relationship between celestial motion and human activity. The passage of time continues to follow its course, carrying patterns that may still be unfolding beyond what has yet been fully understood. Nazca lines, messages etched in earth. Aerial perspective reveals what ground-level observation cannot fully comprehend, as immense figures and lines only begin to form coherent meaning when seen from above. From the arid expanse of southern Peru's Nazca Desert, these markings extend across the landscape in proportions that defy ordinary perception, suggesting intent that only becomes apparent when distance alters the relationship between viewer and ground. Their scale alone introduces a fundamental tension between creation and recognition, as something so carefully arranged cannot be fully appreciated from the position in which it was made. Surface stones were carefully removed to expose lighter desert soil beneath, producing contrasting lines that defined shapes across the arid terrain of southern Peru. This technique, known as geoglyph construction, relied on clearing darkened surface rocks to reveal the brighter earth below, forming continuous outlines that could extend for kilometers. The simplicity of the method contrasts with the complexity of the resulting figures, which include straight lines, geometric forms, and stylized depictions of animals and plants embedded into the desert surface. Spanning vast stretches of the Nazca Desert, geometric figures and elongated lines extend with a precision that becomes apparent only when distance removes the limits of human scale. Some lines run remarkably straight over long distances, while others converge or intersect in patterns that suggest deliberate planning rather than random placement. Among the most recognized forms are depictions such as hummingbirds, monkeys, and spiders, each integrated into a broader network of markings that covers an area so large that its full structure is only visible from elevated viewpoints. Dry atmospheric conditions and minimal rainfall contributed to the long-term preservation of the geoglyphs, allowing them to remain largely intact across centuries. The surrounding environment, characterized by extreme aridity and limited natural disturbance, created conditions in which surface alterations could endure without rapid erosion. This environmental stability has played a crucial role in preserving the clarity of the designs, ensuring that their original outlines remain legible despite the passage of time. Archaeological interpretations remain divided regarding purpose, with suggestions ranging from ceremonial pathways to astronomical alignment markers, none confirmed with absolute certainty. Some theories propose that the lines were used in ritual contexts connected to water and fertility, while others suggest alignment with celestial events or constellations. However, no single explanation has been universally accepted, and the absence of written records from the creators leaves their intent open to ongoing scholarly debate. Large-scale coordination was required to trace extensive designs across uneven desert surfaces, despite the fact that their full forms were not visible from ground level. The execution of such expansive patterns implies organized labor and careful planning, as maintaining proportional accuracy over long distances would have required sustained effort and communication. Yet the exact methods used to guide layout across such a scale remain partially inferred, based on archaeological study rather than direct historical documentation. Ongoing research has yet to resolve the relationship between form, function, and intention within the Nazca geoglyphs, leaving their full meaning open to interpretation. Advances in aerial imaging and ground analysis have expanded understanding of their structure, but have not eliminated uncertainty regarding their original purpose. The lack of definitive explanation continues to position the Nazca lines within a space between art, communication, and ritual practice. Meaning appears to shift depending on perspective, as if the designs were never meant to be understood from the same position in which they were created. The Olmec colossal heads, faces of the unknown. Immense stone faces emerge abruptly from the surrounding terrain, presenting human expression at a scale that feels both familiar and disquieting. Their presence is immediate and unavoidable, as if the landscape itself has been interrupted by memory carved into permanence. These colossal heads stand as some of the most striking creations associated with the Olmec cultural tradition of ancient Mesoamerica, challenging modern perception through their sheer physical dominance and unexplained individuality. Massive basalt blocks used in their creation were transported from distant volcanic sources, requiring sustained effort across challenging terrain and long distances. The nearest known basalt quarries lie many kilometers away from the sites where the heads were ultimately placed, indicating that large groups of workers were likely involved in their movement and shaping. Without modern machinery, the relocation of such heavy stone would have demanded coordinated labor, likely using rollers, rafts, and other basic engineering methods adapted to the landscape. Distinct facial characteristics appear across each carved head, suggesting deliberate variation rather than uniform representation. Some display rounded features, while others show more angular structure, with differences in expression, headgear, and proportions that indicate individualized design. This variation has led researchers to conclude that the heads were not generic figures, but intended to represent specific identities or roles within Olmec society, even if those identities are no longer clearly understood. Early Mesoamerican societies associated with the Olmec cultural tradition produced these monumental works during a period spanning roughly 1500 to 400 BC. Often considered one of the earliest major civilizations in the region, the Olmec are linked to developments in monumental sculpture, ceremonial centers, and early forms of symbolic representation. The colossal heads remain among their most enduring contributions, reflecting a cultural emphasis on scale, presence, and carved permanence. Proposed interpretations differ widely, with suggestions ranging from depictions of rulers to symbolic ancestral figures, none confirmed with certainty. Some scholars associate the helmets worn by several heads with ceremonial or athletic significance, while others propose connections to leadership or political authority. The absence of written records from the Olmec period leaves these interpretations open, relying instead on archaeological context and comparative analysis with later Mesoamerican cultures. Stone carving at this scale transformed human likeness into a permanent form of authority that outlasts spoken memory or written record. Unlike portable objects or temporary constructions, these heads were designed to remain fixed within the landscape, anchoring identity and material form. Their durability has allowed them to persist for thousands of years, even as the meanings originally attached to them have faded from historical continuity. Archaeological investigation has not produced definitive identification for the individuals represented by the colossal heads, leaving their original identities unresolved. Each face continues to present a clear human presence without a corresponding name, lineage, or documented story that survives in the historical record. This gap between recognition and knowledge defines their enduring mystery, as the figures remain visually certain but historically incomplete. Recognition remains immediate, yet the names behind the faces have dissolved into silence that no surviving record can fully restore. Andean engineering, roads above the clouds. Sheer elevation defines the Andean world, where land rises abruptly into thin air, and every movement is shaped by altitude rather than distance. Along the spine of the Andes Mountains, steep ridges, deep valleys, and shifting climates create a landscape that resists easy passage, forcing those who live within it to confront conditions that change dramatically within short distances. Oxygen thins as elevation increases, temperatures fluctuate sharply between day and night, and terrain often fractures into unstable slopes, leaving little room for conventional movement or construction. Across these shifting heights, an intricate network of pathways extended over mountains, valleys, and deserts, forming what is now known as the Capac Nan. This vast road system, developed and expanded by the Inca civilization, stretched for tens of thousands of kilometers across Western South America, linking distant regions into a connected whole. Rather than following a single continuous route, the network adapted to regional geography, branching into multiple paths that navigated deserts along the coast, ascended into highland plateaus, and crossed some of the most rugged terrain on the continent. Rather than resisting the terrain, Andean builders adapted to it, carving narrow stone roads into slopes and suspending bridges across deep and unstable gaps. Staircases were cut directly into mountainsides to manage steep ascents, while retaining walls stabilized paths along cliffs where a single misstep could prove fatal. In places where valleys became impassable, suspension bridges constructed from woven plant fibers spanned rivers and chasms, requiring regular rebuilding yet maintaining continuity across otherwise inaccessible space. In certain sections, stones were cut and fitted together without mortar, forming tightly interlocked surfaces that could shift slightly during seismic activity without collapsing. This technique, refined over time, allowed pathways and structural supports to endure in a region where the ground itself was rarely stable. Constant exposure to wind, erosion, seismic activity, and extreme temperature shifts placed continuous strain on every constructed route. Landslides could erase sections of road without warning, while seasonal rains altered river levels and weakened structural supports. Builders accounted for these pressures by designing flexible and repairable systems, allowing sections to be maintained or reconstructed without disrupting the entire network, reflecting a deep understanding of environmental instability. Movement along these routes enabled communication, coordination, and the transport of goods across vast and vertically separated regions. Messengers known as chasqui travelled in relay, carrying information across long distances with remarkable speed, while caravans of llamas transported supplies through narrow passages that larger animals could not navigate. These pathways allowed for administrative control over distant territories, ensuring that decisions and resources could move efficiently despite the challenges imposed by geography. Communities living along these gradients developed ways of life that aligned with elevation, adjusting agriculture, settlement, and travel to the demands of the landscape. Crops were cultivated at different altitudes to maximize environmental variation, while settlements were positioned to take advantage of defensible terrain and access to routes. Daily life became inseparable from movement across slopes and pathways, embedding the road system into the rhythms of survival and social organization. Recognition of this system reveals a scale of infrastructure that ranks among the most extensive achieved without modern technology. Even in its fragmented state today, the remnants of these roads trace lines across mountains that continue to challenge modern travelers, offering a glimpse into a network that once sustained an entire civilization across one of the most demanding environments on Earth. What endures is not only the path itself, but the realization that entire worlds were once connected across heights where survival alone seems uncertain. The invention of coinage, the birth of money. Before value could be fixed, exchange depended entirely on negotiation, where every transaction required agreement that was never guaranteed. Goods were traded directly for other goods, often requiring both parties to possess something the other desired at the same moment, a condition that was not always easily met. The worth of an item could shift depending on need, availability or circumstance, making exchange inconsistent and at times inefficient across growing communities. In the region of Lydia during the 7th century BC, small pieces of electrum began to take on consistent shapes and weights, marking a departure from informal trade. Electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, provided a material that could be divided and standardized, allowing for recognizable units that did not depend on immediate negotiation. These early coins, often irregular in form yet deliberate in measure, introduced a level of consistency that had previously been absent in everyday exchange. Yet the composition of electrum varied naturally, with differing amounts of gold and silver that were not always immediately visible, leaving the precise value of each piece partly uncertain even as it circulated. Stamped symbols impressed onto these metal pieces signalled more than decoration, embedding authority into objects that could now carry recognized worth. Marks placed onto the surface of coins indicated that their weight and composition had been verified, transforming them into instruments of trust backed by issuing powers. This shift meant that value no longer had to be personally assessed with each transaction, as the coin itself carried a form of guaranteed equivalence accepted within a wider community. With value no longer needing to be argued each time, transactions could occur between individuals who shared no prior relationship. Exchange became faster and more predictable, enabling trade to extend beyond immediate circles and into broader networks. Markets could function with greater efficiency, as goods were no longer directly tied to barter, but could be exchanged through a common medium that simplified interaction. From these early origins, the use of coinage spread into neighbouring regions, particularly among Greek city-states, where trade networks were already expanding. Different communities began producing their own coins, often marked with symbols that reflected local identity, while maintaining consistent weight standards. As coinage moved across regions, it allowed for more structured economic activity, supporting the growth of trade routes and interactions that connected distant areas. As these objects circulated, value began to detach from specific goods, becoming something that could be stored, counted, and transferred across time. Wealth was no longer limited to perishable resources or bulky materials, but could exist in compact, durable form. This transformation altered how individuals understood possession and exchange, introducing the ability to accumulate and measure value in ways that extended beyond immediate use. What began as a localized innovation gradually established a framework that would underpin increasingly complex economic interactions. Systems of exchange grew around the presence of standardized value, shaping patterns of trade, labor, and resource distribution across expanding societies. The simplicity of a marked piece of metal carried implications that extended far beyond its size, influencing how communities organized themselves and interacted over distance. Once value could be held in the hand, exchange no longer depended on circumstance, and something far less visible began to shape the course of human decisions. Ancient medicine, healing before science. No clear boundary existed between the body and the unknown when illness first appeared in the ancient world. Suffering emerged without explanation, and in the absence of internal medical understanding, the causes of disease were often interpreted through a mixture of observation, fear, and inherited belief. The human body became a site where the visible effects of illness were real, but the reasons behind them remained hidden. Ancient medicine emerged as one of the earliest attempts to confront illness through structured healing practices. Attempts to relieve suffering drew from a wide blend of physical remedies, spoken invocations, and inherited ritual practices. Herbal mixtures, compresses, and rudimentary procedures were applied alongside chants or prayers, reflecting a worldview in which healing did not separate the physical from the symbolic. In this early framework, recovery was understood as something influenced by multiple forces acting together, rather than a single identifiable cause. Patterns gradually emerged as similar forms of illness were observed, repeating across different individuals and environments. Fevers, wounds, and infections began to show recognizable characteristics, allowing early observers to distinguish between conditions even if they did not fully understand their origins. This recognition marked an early shift from purely reactive treatment toward a more structured form of observation. Records from regions such as ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia reveal structured efforts to document injuries, conditions, and treatments. These early accounts show attempts to categorize symptoms and record remedies, suggesting that healing practices were becoming increasingly organized. While still limited by the knowledge of the time, such documentation indicates a growing awareness that medical experience could be preserved and studied. Alongside physical treatment, explanations of disease often extended into spiritual frameworks that shaped both diagnosis and care. Illness was frequently understood as something that could reflect imbalance, disruption, or external influence beyond the body itself. As a result, healing practices often required both practical intervention and ritual action, reflecting a worldview in which the seen and unseen were deeply connected. Gradually, certain practitioners became consistently associated with treating illness, separating healing knowledge from general daily life. These individuals developed reputations based on experience and perceived skill, marking an early form of specialization within society. Over time, this distinction contributed to the gradual emergence of healing as a distinct role rather than a shared communal practice. Understanding of internal anatomy remained restricted, leading to treatments based largely on external observation and symptom-based reasoning. Without detailed knowledge of internal organs or biological processes, early medicine relied heavily on visible signs and patterns of behavior. Despite these limitations, repeated observation allowed for incremental improvements in diagnosis and treatment approaches. Through repeated attempts to observe and intervene, early medical practices established patterns that later systems would refine into structured disciplines. Techniques and remedies were tested through experience, and while many remained ineffective by modern standards, they contributed to a growing body of practical knowledge. This gradual accumulation of understanding laid the groundwork for more systematic approaches to health in later civilizations. Every try to heal also became an attempt to understand what the body was trying to hide. Metallurgy, mastering fire and earth. Hidden within ordinary rock formations, certain materials appeared that did not fracture or behave like the surrounding stone when struck or handled. Long before they were understood, these unusual substances stood out simply because they responded differently to pressure, heat, and shaping, quietly hinting that the earth contained hidden possibilities beyond what stone alone could offer. In these early encounters, humans were not yet reshaping matter, but noticing that some parts of it resisted expectation. Sustained exposure to intense heat revealed that some earthly substances could lose their original form and re-emerge as something entirely different. Within fire, materials softened, flowed, or separated in ways that suggested transformation rather than destruction, marking one of the earliest recognitions that controlled burning could alter the structure of matter itself. This discovery did not arrive as a single moment, but as repeated observations of change occurring under extreme conditions. Copper became one of the first materials to respond predictably to human shaping, offering both opportunity and constraint in early toolmaking. It could be hammered, melted, and recast, allowing for more refined objects than those made from stone, yet it remained too soft for many demanding uses. Even so, its adaptability made it a turning point in how tools and decorative objects were produced. The deliberate mixing of copper with tin produced a harder metal that significantly expanded what early societies could construct and weaponize. This new material, later known as bronze, marked a decisive shift in technological capability as tools became more durable, weapons more effective, and crafted objects more consistent in form. Its introduction reshaped entire regions as its advantages became widely recognized. Knowledge of metalworking techniques moved gradually across regions connected through exchange networks extending into areas such as Mesopotamia. Through trade, migration, and cultural contact, methods of smelting, casting, and alloying spread beyond their points of origin, adapting to local resources and environmental conditions. This diffusion ensured that metallurgy did not remain isolated, but became a shared technological development across multiple civilizations. Agricultural production, construction methods, and warfare all shifted as metal tools replaced earlier stone-based technologies. Fields could be worked more efficiently, structures could be built with greater precision, and conflicts were transformed by the introduction of stronger and more reliable weapons. These changes did not occur uniformly, but where metallurgy took hold, it redefined the balance between human effort and environmental resistance. The complexity of working with heat and ore led to the rise of individuals whose entire skill set centered on controlling transformation processes. These early metalworkers developed practical knowledge of furnace temperatures, material selection, and timing, refining their craft through repetition and observation. Their role became increasingly distinct within communities, as their expertise required both experience and specialized attention. Iron introduced a new level of difficulty in extraction and refinement, requiring higher temperatures and more advanced techniques than previous metals. Unlike copper or bronze, iron ore demanded more controlled conditions to produce usable material, making its mastery a significant technological leap. Once achieved, however, it offered strength and abundance that would eventually surpass earlier metals in importance. Through repeated experimentation with fire and ore, humans established a reliable process for converting raw earth into functional shaped materials. What began as an uncertain observation evolved into controlled practice, where transformation could be repeated with increasing consistency. Metallurgy, in this sense, became one of the earliest systems where natural materials were not merely used, but fundamentally changed into something new. The moment matter could be deliberately changed, human control over the physical world began to take a permanent form. The Silk Road, a web of exchange. Vast stretches of land once separated early civilizations so completely that direct contact between them was rare and uncertain. These distances were not only geographical but also cultural, creating worlds that developed independently with only faint awareness of what existed beyond their immediate horizons. Yet even in this separation, the possibility of connection slowly began to take shape through occasional and indirect movement. Gradually, points of contact began to form where neighbouring regions exchanged goods along emerging pathways of travel. These early routes were not planned or unified, but developed through repeated use, as traders and travellers followed practical paths between settlements. Over time, these fragmented movements began to link together, forming the earliest structure of long-distance exchange. Certain highly valued materials encouraged movement across long distances, drawing traders into increasingly extended routes of exchange. Items such as silk, spices, precious metals, and crafted goods carried value far beyond their places of origin, making the risks of travel worthwhile. These commodities did more than circulate wealth. They created motivation for sustained and repeated contact between distant societies. Mountain ranges, deserts, and open steppe landscapes shaped the direction and limits of movement across Eurasia's interior. Geography did not simply challenge travel, it determined it, forcing movement into corridors where survival was possible. As a result, routes formed not in straight lines, but in adaptive paths shaped by water sources, terrain, and seasonal conditions. Networks of exchange eventually linked regions such as ancient China, Central Asia, and ancient Rome through indirect but continuous contact. No single authority controlled these connections, yet goods and influences moved steadily between them through a chain of intermediaries. Each region became part of a wider system without fully seeing the scale of the network it was contributing to. Alongside physical goods, knowledge, beliefs, and technologies moved between societies through the same channels of trade. Techniques of craftsmanship, agricultural practices, and cultural ideas shifted between regions, often transformed as they passed through different environments. Exchange became not only economic, but intellectual and cultural in nature. Travel along these routes required constant adjustment to environmental uncertainty, logistical limitations, and shifting regional conditions. Caravans and traders depended on local knowledge, seasonal timing, and cooperation with multiple communities along the way. The journey itself became fragmented, with no single traveller experiencing the entire system from end to end. Over extended periods, sustained exchange gradually influenced economic structures, cultural practices, and technological development across multiple regions. Societies that participated in these networks adapted to new goods and ideas, integrating them into local systems in unexpected ways. The long-term effect was not a uniform change, but a layered transformation shaped by continuous interaction. Rather than forming a single continuous road, these pathways functioned as a shifting network of interconnected routes spanning continents. What later came to be understood as the Silk Road was never a fixed structure, but a changing system that evolved with the needs of those who used it. Its form existed only through movement, not permanence. Even when civilizations stood separated by distance and silence, exchange continued in motion that never fully stopped. Ancient navigation, finding direction without maps. Beyond the boundaries of early settlements in regions such as ancient Mesopotamia and surrounding unfamiliar terrain, movement into unknown space created a constant challenge of orientation without stable reference points. Travelers stepping away from familiar routes faced landscapes that offered no fixed markers of direction beyond shifting environmental patterns, requiring continuous interpretation of surroundings to avoid disorientation. In these conditions, navigation emerged not as a formal system, but as a necessary response to uncertainty. On land, early travelers developed methods of navigation that depended on memory, terrain recognition, and environmental familiarity. Paths were remembered through repeated journeys, with landmarks such as rivers, hills, and distinctive formations serving as reference points across otherwise uniform terrain. Over time, these accumulated experiences created informal route knowledge that allowed movement between settlements without written guidance. Patterns in the night sky gradually became reliable markers for direction, offering a stable reference above shifting landscapes. The consistent movement of celestial bodies provided a predictable framework that contrasted with the variability of terrain below, allowing travelers to estimate direction during nighttime travel. Seasonal changes in star positions further supported long-distance orientation across unfamiliar regions. Maritime travel in regions linked to ancient Egypt required interpretation of wind, shoreline visibility, and water movement to maintain course. Without fixed coastal maps or navigational instruments, sailors relied on observable environmental conditions, adjusting their movement based on subtle shifts in weather and sea behavior. Coastal navigation often remained within sight of land, reinforcing the importance of recognizable geographic features. Subtle environmental cues such as bird movement, current shifts, and changes in horizon color were carefully observed during long journeys. These indicators provided indirect signals of proximity to land or alterations in environmental conditions, allowing experienced travelers to adjust their direction accordingly. Navigation, in this sense, relied on accumulated sensitivity to patterns rather than precise measurement. Without fixed instruments or mapped coordinates, each journey carried uncertainty that had to be managed through experience and judgment. Decisions about direction were often made in real time, based on changing conditions rather than predetermined routes. This uncertainty made navigation both a practical skill and an adaptive form of knowledge shaped by repetition and observation. Knowledge of routes and directional techniques was preserved through oral transmission and repeated practice across generations. Experienced travelers passed down their understanding of terrain, skies, and environmental cues to those who followed, ensuring continuity of navigational knowledge without written systems. This transfer of experience allowed navigation skills to evolve gradually over time. Accumulated observations slowly began forming repeatable methods for orienting travel across both land and sea. As patterns became more widely recognized, they contributed to increasingly reliable approaches to movement, even in the absence of formal mapping systems. These early methods represented the foundation of structured navigation based on empirical experience. The ability to interpret space without maps reflects an early form of cognitive adaptation to complex and changing environments. Navigation became a demonstration of human capacity to read patterns in nature, transforming uncertainty into manageable movement through observation and memory. This ability allowed ancient societies to extend their reach far beyond familiar boundaries. Direction existed long before maps, carried instead in the memory of those who learned to read the world itself. Early democracies, power in the hands of citizens. In the earliest structures of governance, decision-making remained concentrated within ruling figures and established elite groups. Authority was maintained through inherited position, military strength, or religious legitimacy, leaving little space for broader participation in political processes. Within these systems, governance functioned as a vertical structure where direction flowed from a small centre of control. Gradual shifts in certain communities led to the formation of structured gatherings, where multiple voices could influence outcomes. These early assemblies did not immediately replace established authority, but they introduced the idea that collective input could shape decisions affecting the wider population. Over time, participation in such gatherings became more organised and formally recognised. Belonging to a political community began to carry defined responsibilities, linking individual identity with shared governance roles. Participation was no longer solely a matter of proximity or obligation, but increasingly connected to recognised civic status. This connection between identity and governance laid the groundwork for more structured forms of political involvement. Formalised systems of assembly and voting developed in regions such as ancient Greece, where participation followed emerging procedural rules. Decisions were shaped through debate, structured participation, and collective agreement within defined civic frameworks. These systems represented some of the earliest known attempts to institutionalise public political involvement. Access to political participation remained restricted, shaped by social categories that determined who could and could not contribute to decision-making. Citizenship itself was often limited by criteria such as gender, status, and origin, meaning that participation was far from universal. As a result, early democratic systems combined inclusion with significant exclusion. Public argumentation became an organised feature of governance, where opposing viewpoints were expressed within defined institutional settings. Debate was not treated as a disruption, but as an essential mechanism for reaching collective decisions. This structured exchange of ideas helped define how authority was exercised within participatory systems. The introduction of participatory systems altered how decisions were made, affecting both political stability and the pace of governance. While collective decision-making allowed for broader input, it also required negotiation and compromise among competing perspectives. These dynamics shaped how communities balanced efficiency with representation. Ideas developed within early democratic systems gradually influenced later forms of political organisation across different regions and eras. Even where direct participation did not exist, the concept of shared governance continued to inform political thought and institutional development. Its legacy extended beyond its original context into broader discussions of authority and representation. Rather than forming a fixed system, early democracy functioned as an ongoing experiment in distributing authority among members of a political community. Its structure evolved in response to internal tensions between control and participation, never fully resolving the balance between the two. This made it less a finished model and more a developing political process. Power, once shared even in limited form, never remained exactly where it first began. Religious monuments, temples as centres of power, natural landscapes such as rivers, mountains, caves, and elevated ground are given spiritual meaning long before formal construction exists. Human groups begin associating specific places with unseen forces, interpreting these environments as thresholds between the physical world and something beyond direct perception. These early perceptions of sacred space form the earliest foundations of what would later become structured religious architecture. Temporary gathering spaces gradually evolve into permanent built environments as societies seek to preserve and control locations of ritual importance. Early communities begin constructing durable stone and brick structures intended for repeated ceremonial use, rather than seasonal or temporary gatherings. This shift marks the beginning of sacred architecture as a lasting feature of human civilization. Religious buildings begin to function beyond worship alone as they take on roles in storage, resource management, and communal organization. Within these structures, goods are collected, redistributed, and recorded, linking spiritual authority with practical governance. Sacred space becomes directly connected to economic stability and the coordination of early society. Civilizations such as ancient Egypt developed monumental design systems that reflect ideas of cosmic order and divine hierarchy. Scale, symmetry, and material selection are carefully employed to express permanence and authority within the built environment. Architecture in this context becomes a physical representation of beliefs about the structure of the universe. Rulers and priesthoods reinforce political authority by associating leadership with control over sacred monuments. Access to these spaces often determines influence over both spiritual interpretation and civic governance. In this way, religious architecture becomes a tool through which power is legitimized and maintained. Ceremonies tied to seasonal cycles, agricultural rhythms, and celestial observations structure communal life around recurring sacred events. Religious monuments serve as fixed locations where these rituals are performed, reinforcing shared cultural timing and collective participation. Through repetition, ritual becomes a mechanism for maintaining social order. Similar temple-centered systems emerge in regions such as ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Greece, where sacred architecture consistently integrates belief systems with administrative and civic functions. Despite cultural differences, these structures reveal a recurring pattern in which religion and governance operate within the same physical spaces. This parallel development suggests a shared human tendency to anchor authority in sacred form. Many religious monuments continue to stand long after the civilizations that built them have changed or disappeared. These structures remain as physical records of belief systems that no longer operate in their original form. Their survival transforms them into enduring evidence of how past societies understood power and meaning. Religious monuments do not remain fixed in purpose or interpretation, instead continuing to reflect shifting ideas of identity and authority over time. As cultures evolve, these structures are reinterpreted, repurposed, or reimagined while retaining their symbolic weight. Sacred architecture becomes a living expression of how civilizations externalize the invisible. Power expressed through sacred space continues to shape how civilizations define meaning beyond what can be seen. Art and sculpture, capturing the human form. Human figures first appeared in material form as simplified shapes that emphasized meaning over anatomical precision. These early representations were not intended to replicate exact physical appearance, but to express ideas about life, identity, and symbolic presence. Through reduction and abstraction, the human form became a vessel for meaning rather than direct imitation. Different regions experimented with stone, clay, metal, and other materials to determine how the human form could be physically represented. Each material imposed its own limitations and possibilities, shaping the level of detail, scale, and durability achievable in sculpted figures. Over time, the choice of medium became as significant as the subject being depicted. In regions such as ancient Mesopotamia, sculpted human figures often reflected status, role, or symbolic meaning rather than individual likeness. These works emphasized position within society or connection to divine authority rather than personal identity. The human form was used as a visual language of hierarchy and function. Artistic traditions in ancient Egypt and later ancient Greece increasingly focused on balance, proportion, and idealized human structure. This shift introduced new approaches to representing the body, where symmetry and measured form became central to artistic expression. The human figure began to reflect not only presence, but also concepts of order and ideal form. Statues and carved figures became enduring tools for preserving authority, identity, and remembrance beyond physical life. Rulers, officials, and symbolic figures were rendered in durable materials to extend their presence across time. In this way, sculpture functioned as both representation and continuity. Placement of sculptures in temples, civic areas, and burial sites shaped how communities visually interpreted leadership and cultural values. These figures were not isolated artworks, but part of larger spatial environments that influenced how people experienced authority and tradition. Public visibility gave sculpture a role in shaping collective perception. Advancements in carving, casting, and modeling techniques gradually allowed artists to produce more detailed and naturalistic human representations. Improvements in tools and methods enabled greater control over texture, proportion, and expression. As techniques evolved, so too did the complexity of visual storytelling through form. Across different civilizations, independent artistic traditions developed methods for representing the human form with varying degrees of realism and abstraction. Despite geographic separation, similar challenges in depicting anatomy and identity led to parallel solutions. This reflects a shared human effort to translate perception into physical form. Visual art and sculpture ultimately became enduring records of how ancient societies understood identity, presence, and human significance. These works preserved not only physical likenesses, but also cultural values embedded in form and style. Through them, ancient civilizations recorded how they chose to define humanity. Stone remembered the human form long after the hands that shaped it had disappeared. Ancient warfare, strategy, technology, and conquest. Within the human body, illness first appeared as a disruption without clarity, where pain and weakness were experienced long before any understanding of their origin existed. Symptoms emerged without a visible cause, transforming everyday life into uncertainty when the body no longer functioned as expected. Fever, injury, and disease could alter a person's condition rapidly, leaving communities to confront conditions they could observe but not fully explain. Across early societies, repeated encounters with similar symptoms led to careful attention being given to patterns of recovery and deterioration. Certain plants were found to ease pain or reduce swelling, while others proved ineffective or harmful, creating an early body of practical knowledge built through experience. Healers began to rely on memory and observation, recognizing that some treatments produced consistent results even when the reasons behind them remained unclear. Spiritual interpretations often accompanied physical symptoms, with illness frequently attributed to forces beyond direct human perception. In many cultures, disease was linked to supernatural influence, imbalance, or unseen entities, leading to rituals, incantations, and ceremonial practices intended to restore health. These beliefs existed alongside practical remedies, forming an approach to healing that combined physical intervention with attempts to address causes thought to lie beyond the visible body. In certain archaeological contexts, evidence of surgical intervention, such as trepanation, suggests that attempts were made to physically alter the body in response to injury or disorder. Openings were carefully created in the skull, sometimes showing signs of healing that indicate survival after the procedure. While the exact purpose remains debated, such practices demonstrate a willingness to intervene directly, even in ways that carry significant risk. Written medical traditions, including Egyptian papyri such as the Ebers Papyrus and later Greek medical writings, documented observed symptoms alongside proposed treatments. These texts reflect efforts to record knowledge in a structured form, preserving information about conditions, remedies, and outcomes. In the Greek world, approaches associated with the Hippocratic tradition began to emphasize natural explanations for illness, marking a gradual shift toward observation over purely supernatural interpretation. Treatment outcomes varied widely, with some herbal remedies and techniques producing relief, while others failed or introduced additional complications. Without a full understanding of anatomy or disease, healers operated within a space where success and error were closely intertwined. Each attempt added to a growing awareness of what might work, even as uncertainty remained a constant presence in every decision. In many cases, treatments addressed visible symptoms while the underlying causes remained hidden, creating situations where relief could be temporary or misleading. Early medical practice gradually formed the basis for more systematic approaches to studying the body, even as certainty about cause and effect remained incomplete. Over time, accumulated observations began to shape more consistent methods of diagnosis and treatment, laying the groundwork for future developments. What began as fragmented efforts to respond to illness gradually evolved into a sustained attempt to understand the human body through experience and record. The act of trying to heal came before the ability to fully understand what was being healed, and that gap quietly reshaped the relationship between human life and its own fragility. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, guiding the ancient world. Across stretches of open water where direction could dissolve into guesswork, the absence of visible landmarks turned navigation into a fragile calculation, leaving sailors dependent on stars, memory, and shifting winds as they moved through an environment that offered little warning of approaching danger. Coastlines could appear suddenly and without clarity, while submerged hazards remained invisible until it was too late, making every journey towards land an exercise in uncertainty, shaped as much by experience as by risk. From the coastline near Alexandria, a towering structure emerged that could be recognized long before the land itself came into focus, rising from the island of Pharos as a deliberate interruption to the flat horizon that surrounded it. Constructed during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus and attributed to the architect Sostratus of Cnidus, The lighthouse was built in a tiered form that combined a broad base, a narrowing middle section, and a final tower, reaching a height that made it one of the tallest structures of the ancient world. At its summit, a sustained source of light converted elevation into communication, projecting a clear signal across the surrounding sea through fire by night and reflective surfaces by day. This was not simply illumination, but intention made visible, as the structure transformed light into a message that could be understood without language, guiding ships towards safety while warning of proximity to land. In this way, distance itself became manageable, no longer defined solely by uncertainty, but by the presence of something fixed and deliberately placed. Around its position, the harbour of Alexandria became a focal point for movement, linking distant regions through maritime exchange as vessels carrying goods, ideas, and people converged along routes that depended on reliable points of arrival. The lighthouse did not operate in isolation, but as part of a broader system in which navigation, trade, and urban life intersected, reinforcing the city's role as one of the most significant centres of the Mediterranean world. Through successive generations, the structure remained standing as both a navigational aid and a visible marker of human capability before natural forces began to weaken it, with earthquakes gradually damaging its form over time. Recognised as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, it endured for centuries before its upper sections collapsed, and its stones were eventually repurposed, leaving only fragments where a defining landmark had once dominated the horizon. In the centuries that followed its decline, the principles it embodied continued to influence how distant shores were approached, as later lighthouses adopted its essential purpose of using height and light to guide movement across open water. The very term pharos, derived from its location, became synonymous with the lighthouse itself, preserving its function in language even as its physical presence disappeared. Guidance no longer required its presence, yet the expectation of light in the distance had already taken hold. The Antikythera mechanism, a machine beyond its time. A collection of heavily corroded bronze fragments, later identified as part of the Antikythera mechanism, was recovered in 1901, which at first offered no indication of having once formed a coherent object. The surfaces were thick with mineral deposits, their shapes irregular and incomplete, leaving only fragments of metal that seemed indistinguishable from ordinary wreckage pulled from the sea. For those who first examined them, there was nothing immediately remarkable in their appearance, only the quiet suggestion of something long submerged and broken beyond recognition. Among the irregular shapes, faint patterns of interlocking metal began to suggest a level of intentional construction rather than natural decay. Subtle alignments in the fragments hinted at repeated structure, where curved edges and carved notches appeared too deliberate to be random corrosion or chance formation. As the debris was carefully cleaned and separated, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility that these pieces had once belonged to a single, organised mechanism. With closer analysis, the fragments began to reveal a structure designed not for display or utility in daily life, but for calculating movements of astronomical bodies. Inscriptions etched into the metal surfaces referenced cycles of the sun and moon, pointing toward a function tied to tracking celestial patterns over time. What had first seemed like inert debris now suggested an object built to translate the motion of the heavens into measurable mechanical form. What initially appeared as unrelated pieces of metal resolved into a system of precisely cut gears operating in coordinated motion. The interlocking components indicated a level of mechanical precision that required deliberate planning and advanced understanding of geometry and movement. Each gear, once placed in relation to the others, contributed to a larger system capable of transforming rotation into calculated prediction. No comparable mechanical tradition is clearly documented in the centuries that followed its creation. Devices of similar complexity do not appear again in the archaeological or historical record for over 1,000 years, leaving a gap between what this mechanism achieved and what is known of later technological development. This absence has led to ongoing uncertainty about whether such knowledge was isolated, lost, or never widely transmitted beyond its original context. Its reconstruction challenges assumptions about the limits of technological understanding in the ancient world. Rather than standing as an isolated curiosity, the mechanism suggests the existence of a tradition of mechanical and astronomical knowledge that has not been fully preserved in surviving records. It reshapes the boundary between what is considered possible and what is assumed to have been known, forcing a reassessment of how ancient observers understood time and motion. Its gears still turn in theory, but the knowledge that set them in motion has yet to fully return. Urban planning, designing life in cities. Settlements emerging beside rivers and fertile plains gradually expanded through necessity, forming early population centres shaped by survival rather than design. As groups grew larger and space became increasingly constrained, the absence of a coordinated layout began to create friction in movement, resource distribution and daily activity. What began as practical proximity to water and arable land slowly evolved into dense clusters where organisation was not yet intentional but increasingly required. Within early urban centres such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, structured streets and drainage systems revealed some of the earliest known efforts to organise expanding habitation. The presence of grid-like arrangements and engineered waste channels suggests that spatial order was already being considered as a necessary component of urban life. Rather than allowing settlements to grow organically in every direction, certain civilizations began introducing deliberate patterns that shaped how people moved and lived within enclosed spaces. As populations concentrated further, cities began to separate essential functions into designated areas that reflected emerging ideas of order and utility. Residential zones, administrative centres, and communal or ceremonial spaces gradually took on distinct spatial identities, reducing overlap between activities that once coexisted without clear boundaries. This division of space created a more legible urban environment, where the structure of a city began to reflect the structure of its social organisation. Authority within urban environments is increasingly manifested through spatial design, where access, movement, and visibility are shaped by planned structure. Administrative districts were often positioned in ways that allowed control over surrounding activity, while public spaces were arranged to regulate gathering and interaction. In this way, governance was not only enforced through law or decree, but embedded into the physical arrangement of the city itself. Rising population density placed continuous strain on available space, forcing adaptations in layout, infrastructure, and long-term planning strategies. Narrow streets, expanding residential blocks, and increased demand for water and sanitation systems created pressures that required ongoing adjustment. Urban planning became less about initial design and more about continuous response to the changing scale of human concentration. Following the decline or transformation of early settlements, their underlying principles of spatial organisation continued to inform how new cities were arranged. Even when original cities diminished or were replaced, the logic of dividing space, structuring movement, and organising function persisted in later urban developments. These inherited principles formed an invisible framework that guided the shaping of future settlements, even as cultures and governing systems changed. The arrangement of space outlived the forms that first gave it shape, continuing to guide how human presence gathers and expands. Agriculture and irrigation, feeding civilization. Survival in early societies depended entirely on shifting environmental cycles that determined whether food would be abundant or absent, leaving human communities vulnerable to changes in rainfall, temperature, and seasonal patterns that could transform fertile ground into scarcity within a single failed cycle. Before stable food production, every settlement existed in direct dependence on what nature provided without guarantee, and this uncertainty shaped movement, survival strategies, and the scale at which early groups could sustain themselves. In regions such as the Fertile Crescent, early communities began deliberately cultivating plants, marking a transition away from purely foraged food sources. Wild grains were gradually replaced by controlled planting, and over generations, selection of more reliable crops began to reshape the relationship between humans and the land. This shift did not occur as a single moment of invention, but as a slow accumulation of practice, where repeated observation led to intentional reproduction of successful harvests. Along the courses of the Tigris River and the Nile River, water was gradually redirected and distributed through early irrigation practices that regulated seasonal flooding. Channels, basins, and controlled flooding techniques allowed water to reach cultivated areas beyond natural riverbanks, extending the productive capacity of land that would otherwise remain dry or unpredictable. This management of water marked a critical step in transforming environmental fluctuation into a more controlled agricultural rhythm. As food production became more predictable, population levels increased and settlements expanded in ways previously limited by resource uncertainty. Surplus food enabled longer-term habitation, reduced reliance on constant migration, and supported the emergence of specialized roles within communities. The ability to store and distribute grain also created buffers against poor harvests, allowing societies to stabilize even when environmental conditions varied from year to year. Despite its benefits, agricultural reliance introduced new vulnerabilities, as changes in climate or maintenance failures could disrupt entire cycles of production. Irrigation systems required continuous labor to maintain channels and control water flow, and any breakdown in coordination could affect large areas of farmland simultaneously. Soil conditions could also degrade over time, and prolonged imbalance in water distribution sometimes led to reduced fertility, revealing the fragile balance behind agricultural success. Over time, the ability to influence food availability became one of the most defining factors in the stability and continuity of early civilizations. Control over cultivation and irrigation determined not only how societies grew, but how securely they could persist across generations. Food was no longer solely a product of environment, but increasingly a result of organized human intervention in natural cycles. What sustained entire societies was never the land itself, but the fragile agreement between water, soil, and the people who depended on both. Language and literature, stories that outlived empires. Before written records existed, spoken language carried every form of knowledge, relying entirely on human memory for survival across generations. Every story, instruction, and historical account depended on repetition, with meaning shifting subtly each time it was passed from one speaker to another. In this fragile system, the endurance of knowledge was inseparable from the endurance of the human voice itself, making forgetting an ever-present risk within early societies. In regions such as Mesopotamia and Egypt, early writing systems emerged that allowed spoken ideas to be recorded in permanent form. Marks pressed into clay and carved into stone transformed fleeting speech into enduring symbols, creating a separation between the moment of expression and the survival of its meaning. This shift allowed information to exist beyond memory, no longer dependent on continuous oral transmission. Once language could be inscribed rather than spoken alone, communication began to exist independently of the presence of the speaker. Messages could travel beyond the limits of time and distance, reaching individuals who would never encounter the original voice that created them. In this way, language gained a new form of stability, allowing instructions, laws, and accounts to persist without the risk of distortion through repetition. Among the earliest known literary traditions, works such as the Epic of Gilgamesh demonstrate how narrative began to preserve collective memory in structured form. Stories were no longer only retold but carefully arranged into sequences that could be stored, studied, and transmitted with greater consistency. Literature emerged as a method of organizing experience into patterns that could outlast the circumstances of their creation. As civilizations changed or disappeared, written records often remained, carrying fragments of meaning into entirely new cultural contexts. Languages evolved, scripts were forgotten, and original meanings sometimes became obscured, yet the physical traces of communication continued to exist. These remnants allowed later societies to encounter ideas from distant origins, even when the cultural framework that produced them no longer existed. Through accumulated written and oral traditions, human expression developed a form of continuity that extended beyond the lifespan of any single society. Knowledge no longer depended entirely on living memory, as it could now persist in external form, awaiting future interpretation. This transformation marked a shift in how civilizations related to their own past, creating a layered relationship between time, meaning, and preservation. Interpretation kept the past from disappearing completely, allowing voices long gone to remain present through the written form they left behind.